He hadn't spoken to another human being in 8 months, not because no one came, because the ones who did left in pieces. Gideon Mercer wasn't a legend men told around fires to impress each other. He was the warning they gave their sons before sending them west. 3 outlaws. 1 winter night. No witnesses except the wolves, and whatever version of a man walked out of those Montana pines the next morning wasn't the same one who walked in. So when a young woman stumbled up his frozen road at dusk, half dead and holding a letter with his name on it, he didn't reach for his hand. He reached for his rifle. Hit the like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The snow had been falling since mid-afternoon, and by the time dusk pressed its weight against the mountains, the world beyond Gideon Mercer's front window had shrunk to nothing. Just white, dissolving into gray, dissolving into dark. He was sitting at the rough-cut table near the stove, sharpening a hunting knife that didn't need sharpening. It was a habit, not a task. The rhythmic drag of stone against steel gave his hands something to do while his mind stayed where it always was, loose, unanchored, hovering somewhere between present and past without settling on either. The cabin was small. 1 main room with a cast-iron stove, a table, 2 chairs he'd made himself, one of which had a leg slightly shorter than the other and rocked if you leaned wrong. A sleeping area sectioned off by a hanging canvas. A shelf of tools, a shelf of provisions, a rifle above the door, and a pistol under the mattress. Everything he owned could be described in under a minute. He'd built it that way on purpose. Outside, the horses in the barn would be restless in the cold. He'd need to check on them before full dark. That was what he was thinking about, whether the water trough had frozen over again. When the dog lifted its head, Colt was a big gray mutt, part shepherd, part something larger and less domestic. He'd shown up at the ranch fence 4 winters ago, half-starved and hostile, and Gideon had left scraps out for 3 weeks before the animal decided he was trustworthy enough to sleep near. They had an understanding, not warm exactly, but solid. Colt didn't bark at nothing. He was staring at the door now, ears flat, the fur along his spine risen in a ridge. Gideon set the knife down. He didn't move fast. He wasn't the kind of man who moved fast when he didn't have to. He stood, rolled one shoulder where an old break had healed imperfect, and crossed to the window. He angled himself so he could see out without putting his silhouette against the glass. The road coming up to the property was barely a road, more an agreement between 2 ruts and the surrounding wilderness. In summer, you could ride it in an hour from the valley floor. In February, with snow packed hard and the temperature dropping fast, it was a different thing entirely. There was a figure on it. He had to look twice because the shape was wrong. Too small to be a man on horseback. Too upright to be an animal. It was moving on foot, slow, deliberate, slightly listing to one side like something that had been walking for a long time and was running out of whatever had been keeping it going. Gideon watched for a full 20 seconds without blinking. Then he took his rifle from above the door, pulled on his coat, and went outside. The cold hit him like a flat hand against the face. Montana in February wasn't just cold, it was argumentative. It pushed back. He'd lived in it long enough that his body no longer wasted energy flinching, but it wasn't something a man got used to so much as something a man learned to stop fighting. He stood on the porch, rifle held across his body. Not raised, but not put away, and watched the figure approach. It was a woman. That registered slowly, the way things registered when they didn't make sense. A woman, on foot, coming up his road in a snowstorm at last light, wearing a traveling coat that was built for a warmer season and carrying a bag that looked like it had already given up halfway through the journey. She saw him when she was about 40 yards out and stopped. He could see, even at that distance, the effort it took her to stand straight. Her shoulders squared up like she was about to walk into an argument she knew she might lose. Then she started walking again. He didn't move. She came up the road and stopped at the base of the porch steps, looking up at him. She was young, mid-20s maybe, with dark hair plastered wet against her face and eyes that were either brown or very dark green. It was hard to tell in that light. Her lips were pale from cold. Her hands, even wrapped around the bag strap, were shaking, but her jaw was set. "My name is Elena Ashcroft," she said. Her voice came out steadier than her body looked. "My father was William Ashcroft. He told me that if anything ever happened to him, I was to come here." She reached into her coat with one hand, slow and deliberate, the kind of deliberateness that understood a rifle was in the vicinity, and produced a folded envelope. "He left me a letter for you." Gideon didn't take it yet. "William Ashcroft," he said. "Yes." "He's dead." It wasn't a question. The way she'd said if anything ever happened to him, past tense sitting inside future tense, the way people spoke when they'd already crossed the line and were still sorting out the grammar of it. Something crossed her face. Not a flinch. More like the slight adjustment of someone who had already absorbed the blow so many times that it no longer moved them outwardly, only inwardly, in places they didn't show. "6 weeks ago," she said. The wind moved between them, carrying a few degrees colder than a moment before. "Come inside," Gideon said. He turned and opened the door without waiting to see if she followed. She followed. Inside, she stood near the door while he hung the rifle back above the frame and threw another log into the stove. Colt watched her from across the room with the unblinking skepticism of an animal that had learned to take its time forming opinions. "Sit down before you fall down," Gideon said, without turning around. "I'm not going to fall down." "Then sit down anyway." There was a pause. Then he heard the chair scrape, the good one, the one with 4 even legs, and the soft sound of her bag hitting the floor. He filled a tin cup from the kettle that sat permanently on the back of the stove, added some dried bark tea from the shelf, not good, but hot, and set it in front of her. She wrapped both hands around it immediately, and some of the rigid control she'd been holding went slightly soft at the relief of warmth. He sat across from her and held out his hand. She gave him the letter. William Ashcroft's handwriting was the same as Gideon remembered it. Economical, slightly slanted, no wasted loops or flourishes. The man had written the same way he'd talked. "Gideon, if Elena has found you, then I'm already gone, and I'm asking you to do something I have no right to ask. She has no one left. I settled her debts before I died. What was left, anyway. But there's nothing for her to go back to. Her mother's family won't take her. She's too proud to beg and too stubborn to quit, which means she'll do something foolish on her own if someone doesn't intervene. You owe me nothing. I know that's not how you see it, but it's the truth. What I did in Billings, I did because it was right, not to collect on it later. But I'm asking anyway. Help her get on her feet. Give her a place until she can find her own footing. She won't be a burden to you. I can promise you that much, at least. She's got more backbone than men twice her age, and more sense than she lets on. Don't let her starve in a ditch somewhere because I ran out of time. William." Gideon read it twice. Then he folded it exactly as it had been and set it on the table. "What did he tell you?" he asked. "About me?" Elena's hands were steadier around the cup now. The color was returning to her face slowly, like something thawing from the edges inward. "That you were a man who kept his word. That the wilderness suited you better than people. That if I got to your door, you wouldn't turn me away." She paused. "He didn't tell me very much else." "Did he tell you what I did in Billings?" "No." "Did you ask?" She met his eyes. "No." That told him something. He stood and went back to the stove, not because he needed to, but because he needed to think without her watching him do it. He picked up the knife he'd left on the table and turned it over in his hand. William Ashcroft had pulled Gideon out of a burning building 6 years ago. A bar fight that had gone sideways when someone knocked over a lantern and the whole bottom floor had caught in under 3 minutes. Gideon had been unconscious near the back door, taken a bottle across the skull, and William had dragged him out into the street and stayed with him until he could stand. That was all. A simple thing. 10 minutes of one man's life. And yet, he'd spent 6 years carrying it because that was the kind of man he was. Not capable of letting a debt go unmarked, even one the other party refused to acknowledge. "How'd you get here?" he asked, still with his back to her. "Stagecoach to Claryville. Horses after that, with a family heading north as far as the turnoff. I walked the last..." She hesitated. "The last portion." "How far?" Another pause. "About 7 miles." He turned around. She was looking at him evenly, the cup held in both hands, daring him to make something of it. She'd walked 7 miles through Montana snow in a coat that wasn't built for it, alone, in February, with a bag that couldn't have held much. And she was sitting at his table now like it was simply what she'd had to do, and she didn't see the point in dwelling on it. Gideon had known men, hard men, Men who'd lived rough and prided themselves on it, who wouldn't have made that walk. "You're staying tonight," he said. "We'll figure out the rest in the morning." It wasn't a warmly delivered statement. It wasn't an invitation. It was closer to a logistical assessment. The weather was getting worse, the dark was full now, and sending her back out into that was not something he was going to do, whatever else happened. She nodded once. "Thank you," she said. She didn't elaborate and she didn't perform gratitude, just said it plainly like she meant it, and left it there. He gave her the sleeping area behind the canvas and put a second blanket out without comment. He slept in the chair nearest the stove. Not comfortably, but he'd slept in worse, with Colt stretched out beside him. Sometime in the deep middle of the night, he heard her cough once, quietly, like she was trying to keep it to herself. He stared at the ceiling for a while after that, listening to the wind work at the gaps in the walls, and thought about William Ashcroft dragging him through smoke, and didn't sleep again until nearly morning. Dawn came gray and reluctant. Gideon was already up, coffee made, real coffee, not the bark tea, a small accommodation he made without examining the reason for it. When the canvas parted and Elena came through, she'd put herself back together, hair pinned, coat folded over one arm, the composure of last night restored. The only evidence of the previous day was a faint dark shadow under her eyes, and the way she moved slightly carefully, like someone whose feet were still talking to her about the 7 miles. She sat down at the table, wrapped her hands around the coffee cup he set in front of her, and said, "Tell me about the ranch." He looked at her. "I'm not going to be useful to you if I don't know what I'm working with," she said. "My father's letter asked you to help me get on my feet. I assume that means some kind of arrangement. I'd rather know what I'm agreeing to." Gideon sat down across from her. He was quiet for a moment, not evasive, just considering how to describe something he'd mostly stopped thinking about in organized terms. "The land is about 400 acres, he said. "Most of it's good pasture. I run about 60 head of cattle, some horses, a few pigs. The barn's solid. The cabin needs work in places, but holds weather. I do the round work, the fencing, the hunting." He paused. "I'm short on hands. Had 2 last spring. One left in September, the other in November." "Why?" He shrugged. "Too remote, too quiet. Men get out here and realize there's nothing else for miles in any direction, and they start thinking about what they'd rather be doing." Elena looked at him steadily. "And you don't think about that?" "No." She seemed to accept that as factual rather than bravado. "What do you need that you're not getting done?" "The accounts are a mess. I'm not—" He stopped, started again. "Numbers aren't my strength. I've been rough tracking what goes out against what comes in, but I don't know what I actually have. I've been putting off decisions I should have made 6 months ago because I couldn't figure out if I could afford them. The cabin needs a proper cleaning and some organization I haven't gotten around to. The salt stores need rotating, there's 3 months of mending sitting in a pile, and I haven't had a meal that involved more than 2 ingredients in probably 4 years." He said it the same way he'd said everything else. Flat, direct, without apology. Facts about his situation, not complaints. Elena was quiet for a moment. Then, "And what would I get?" "Roof, food, safety." He met her eyes. "There's men in the valley who would take advantage of a woman alone with no resources. That's not a threat. It's just the geography. Here, nobody bothers you. Because they're afraid of you. Mostly." She looked down at her coffee, turned the cup slightly in her hands. He could see her thinking. Not fluttering, not emotional, just thinking, running things through some internal calculation with her eyes slightly unfocused. "This isn't what my father intended," she said finally. "No. He wanted you on your feet with your own life. That takes time and resources. You don't have either right now. You're being very blunt about my situation. Would you prefer I wasn't?" She looked up, and despite everything, the cold, the exhaustion, the strangeness of sitting across from this man she didn't know in a cabin at the edge of the known world, a small, dry thing crossed her face that was almost the beginning of a smile. "No," she said. "Actually, I wouldn't." They stayed in that particular silence for a moment. Then Gideon said, "I have a different proposal." Bonk. She didn't say anything for a long time after he finished talking. He hadn't dressed it up. He'd laid it out like he would lay out a fence plan. Here's the problem. Here's the solution. Here's what each side contributes. A practical marriage, not a romantic arrangement, a legal and logistical one. She would become the ranch's co-owner on paper, which would solve a problem he hadn't told her yet. A land dispute that was quietly developing on his eastern boundary, one that a married couple with a joint deed was considerably better positioned to defend than a lone man with a rifle. She would have legal standing, a name attached to property, and a position that even the roughest elements in the valley tended to respect more than a woman alone. In exchange, she would have exactly what he'd already described: safety, shelter, and time to build towards something of her own. "You've thought about this before this morning," she said. "Some." "You were considering it before I walked in the door." He looked at her directly. "I got a letter from your father 3 weeks ago. He told me he was sick and that you might come." Something shifted in her expression. Not anger exactly, but the recalibration of someone who'd just learned that the ground under her was slightly different than she'd thought. "He wrote to you before he told me," she said. "I don't know what he told you or when." She was quiet for a moment. "He didn't tell me until the last week." Her voice stayed level, but the effort it took was visible to anyone paying attention. "He told me to find you. He didn't tell me what you might—" She stopped. "He didn't say you had a plan." "He didn't know I had a plan. I wasn't sure you'd come." She stood up, which startled Colt into lifting his head. She didn't go anywhere. There wasn't really anywhere to go. Just stood by the window and looked out at the property, which was visible now in the flat gray morning light. The barn, the fences, the white fields stretching toward the tree line. "If I say no," she said, "if I just take a few days here and then find my own way, then that's what you do." "You wouldn't—" "I wouldn't what?" She turned slightly. "Some men would consider the situation leverage." He held her gaze. "I'm not some men." She turned back to the window. He let her think without filling the silence with anything. Eventually she said, still looking at the window, "You said this was partly to protect a land dispute." "My eastern boundary. A woman named Margaret Blackwell has been running cattle across my land for 2 years. Her claim is that the original survey was wrong and the line should sit 40 yards further west on my side. I've been disputing it, but I'm one man without a lawyer and she has money and connections to the county seat." He paused. "A married man with a wife is harder to push around than a bachelor in a remote cabin, legally speaking. Joint property ownership creates complications for anyone trying to establish adverse possession." "Adverse possession," she repeated. "I've been doing some reading." She was quiet. Then, "So this benefits you?" "Yes." "You're being honest about that." "I'm always honest about things like that. It's the other things I'm bad at." She almost made the sound of a laugh, but swallowed it. "I need time to think," she said. "The snow will keep for another day," he said. "Think as long as you need." She helped him with the horses that afternoon without asking permission. Just appeared at the barn door in a borrowed coat. One of his, so large it swamped her, and started filling water buckets from the pump without commentary. He watched her work for a moment, then went back to forking hay. The barn had 8 stalls, 3 occupied by saddle horses, 1 by a draft horse he used for hauling, the rest empty since he'd reduced the herd 2 years ago when the labor situation got thin. The animals were restless from the storm, the big draft horse pawing at his gate, the gray saddle mare pinning ears at nothing. Elena moved among them with a confidence that surprised him slightly. Not recklessness. She didn't overreach, didn't push where the animals didn't want to be pushed, but the quiet certainty of someone who'd been around horses enough that they didn't make her nervous. "Your father had horses," Gideon said. "He always had horses," she said. "We had a small place outside Billings when I was young, before—" She stopped, tilted the last bucket into the trough. "Before things got difficult financially, we had to sell." She didn't elaborate, and her tone didn't invite elaboration. They worked through the afternoon tasks without much talk. It wasn't uncomfortable exactly, more like 2 people mapping the edges of a shared space, figuring out where the boundaries were without yet agreeing on them. At one point, Elena asked about the eastern fence, and he walked her to the barn door and pointed out the direction, told her roughly what the disputed land looked like, how many acres. She asked better questions than he expected, practical, specific, about survey stakes and county records and when the dispute had been officially filed. He answered them, and he noticed, with the same flat interior acknowledgement he gave to most things, that he was talking more than he had in months. That evening she made dinner. It was a simple thing: dried beans soaked through the day, some salt pork, the last of a jar of preserved tomatoes he'd had on the shelf for so long he'd forgotten it was there. She found it without being told, which meant she'd been quietly cataloging the provisions while he wasn't watching. He noticed that too. She sat across from him and they ate, and it was the first meal in years that had involved a second person. He was aware of it in the same way he was aware of temperature or the direction of wind, as a fact of the environment that required some low-level adjustment. "I've decided," she said, when the meal was mostly done. He looked up. "Yes," she said, "to the arrangement you proposed." She held his eyes. "But I want to be clear about what I'm agreeing to and what I'm not." "All right. I'm agreeing to a legal partnership and a shared household. I'm not agreeing to—" She paused, searching for the right words, neither squeamish nor awkward about the subject, just precise. "I'm not agreeing to anything beyond what was proposed." "I understand that." "You're sure?" "I proposed what I proposed," he said. "I don't revise agreements after they're made." She nodded once, and then she picked up her fork and kept eating like the matter was settled, because as far as she was concerned, apparently, it was. Gideon looked at his plate. It occurred to him that William Ashcroft had known exactly what he was doing when he sent her here. Not because it was a convenient solution for a daughter with no prospects, though it was that, but because William had known Gideon, and had known him well enough to know that a woman with backbone and good sense and the willingness to look a man in the eye and tell him exactly what she meant was about the only kind of person who wouldn't either bore or unsettle him inside of a week. He didn't say this. He finished his meal, and Colt settled near his boot, and the stove crackled, and outside the wind continued to work at the walls without getting anywhere. They were married in Claryville 11 days later. The town was not large, a main street with the essentials: a general store, a blacksmith, a church, a saloon, a sheriff's office, a small post house. It sat in the lower valley and served as the closest thing to a center of civilization for roughly 60 miles of frontier. In summer, it swelled somewhat. In February, it contracted down to its permanent residents and the particular hard-bitten character of people who'd chosen to stay through Montana winters. The ceremony took place in the county office, not the church, which suited Gideon fine and to which Elena raised no objection. The county clerk, a thin man named Fowler, with a large mustache and a habit of looking over his spectacles at things he found unusual, looked over his spectacles at them several times throughout the proceedings. It took about 12 minutes. They signed the documents, Fowler witnessed them, and that was that. Outside on the wooden sidewalk, Gideon settled his hat, and Elena buttoned the top button of her coat against the cold. They'd ridden in together in the wagon and would ride back the same way. The awkwardness of the moment, if it was an awkward moment, and Gideon wasn't sure it was, or whether it was supposed to be, passed without ceremony. "We need salt," she said, "and lamp oil, and I need thread, black and brown, at least 20 yards each." He looked at her. "Anything else?" "2 good knives for the kitchen. The ones in the cabin are barely adequate." She paused. "That's my immediate list." They went to the general store. It was managed by a man named Deacon Hollis, who was approximately the opposite of his name: gregarious, nosy, and constitutionally incapable of letting a transaction pass without conversation. He knew Gideon by name and by reputation, and received the information of his recent marriage with undisguised fascination. "Well," he said, looking between them across the counter, "I will be damned." "Likely," Gideon agreed. "Who is this? Where'd you find—" Hollis turned to Elena with the slightly over-eager attention of a man who'd just been handed the most interesting news he'd had in weeks. "Ma'am, I apologize. I'm Deacon Hollis. I've been selling this man goods for going on 6 years, and he has never, not once, given me a single interesting piece of information." "Elena Mercer," she said, and offered her hand like a man would, which Hollis shook with slightly startled pleasure. "Where are you from, if I can ask?" "Outside Billings, originally. Most recently, wherever my feet were pointed." Hollis laughed. Gideon noticed, with some detached interest, that Elena knew how to handle a Deacon Hollis. Not by being closed and cold, which only made such men more determined, but by giving them just enough personality to satisfy them without giving them anything they could actually use. They bought their supplies and loaded the wagon. As they were climbing up, Hollis appeared in the doorway of his store and called after them, "Welcome to the valley, Mrs. Mercer. You picked an interesting place to land." Elena settled her skirts on the wagon bench. "I'm beginning to understand that," she called back. On the ride back, they passed through a section of the valley road that ran along the northern boundary of Margaret Blackwell's property. Gideon didn't point it out explicitly, but he felt Elena noticed the land. 200 acres of visible winter pasture, well fenced, the kind of operation built over time with real money. "Is that her land?" Elena asked. "South side of the road, yes." She studied it for a moment as they passed. "It's well maintained. She runs a professional operation. She must have help. Foreman, at least. 2. A man named Carl Duvain runs her hands. He's capable." Elena turned to look at the road ahead. "Have you spoken to her directly about the boundary?" "Once. About 8 months ago. She was polite enough. Told me the survey error was a matter of fact, not dispute, and that she expected the county to correct it in due course." He paused. "She was very calm about it." "Calm people who are planning something usually are." He glanced at her. She was looking at the road, nothing particular in her expression. "You've known people like that," he said. "My father had a business partner once," she said, and left it there, which told him enough. The valley talked. He'd expected it. Small places generated and consumed information about their inhabitants the way large places consumed goods and commerce, continuously, necessarily, as a basic function of survival. Gideon Mercer, who'd lived alone for 8 years, and was known primarily as someone you didn't want visiting your property with bad intentions, had married a woman no one had seen before, apparently within 2 weeks of her arriving at his cabin in a snowstorm. It had every quality that frontier gossip required: mystery, speed, and the underlying question that everyone was too polite to ask directly and too curious to leave alone. He heard about some of it secondhand, on his next supply run to Claryville, from a rancher named Pete Caldwell, who was the closest possible to decent kind of gossip, the kind who told you what was being said as a courtesy rather than a cruelty. "People are wondering about her family," Caldwell said, leaning against the wall outside the post office, making it casual. "Where she's from, who her people are. Her father was William Ashcroft. He helped me out some years ago in Billings. He passed. She had nowhere else." Caldwell digested this. "People will wonder if there's more to it than that. People can wonder whatever they like." "Yeah," Caldwell scratched his jaw. "Just thought you should know. I appreciate it." He told Elena that evening. She was sitting at the table working through the ranch's accounts, which she'd taken over with quiet efficiency, creating an organized system out of Gideon's loose and mutually contradictory pile of receipts and notations. She'd found a ledger in Claryville and had been at it for 2 days and was beginning to show him things that were sometimes uncomfortable to look at. He told her what Caldwell had said, plainly and without decoration. She kept writing for a moment, then, "Let them wonder. That's my position too. If we're honest about the situation, there's nothing to hide. It was practical and legal, and we've done nothing wrong." She dipped the pen. "People who want to make it something else will do that regardless of what we tell them, so there's no point managing it." He sat down across from her. Colt, predictably, had transferred his primary loyalty to Elena over the past week and a half, and was currently lying under her chair in a posture of complete devotion. Gideon looked at the dog without comment. "I found something in the accounts," Elena said. "Good or bad? Probably both." She turned the ledger toward him and pointed at a column she'd constructed. "You've been undercharging on your cattle sales. Not massively, but consistently. I think because you've been estimating weight on delivery without pushing back on the buyer's numbers. If you'd been accurate on weight the last 2 seasons, you'd have roughly," she pointed at a number, "more than that." He looked at the number. It was substantial. "I didn't have time to argue about weights," he said. "I understand that, but going forward, you need a scale, and you need to use it, and you need someone to be present at delivery who will push back when the numbers are wrong." She looked at him. "I can do that." "You know cattle weights." "I know what leverage looks like," she said, "and I know when someone's taking advantage of the fact that a man wants to move on and doesn't want to stand around arguing." She paused. "I've seen that particular dynamic before." He looked at the number again. 2 seasons of it. There's more, she said. She flipped back a page. The salt stores. You've been paying Hollis a price per pound that's about 12% above what he'd charge a bulk buyer. You're buying enough that you qualify. He just hasn't been telling you that. Gideon was quiet for a moment. He's not cheating me. No, he's just not volunteering information that costs him money. That's different. She looked at him. It's still money you don't have to spend. He leaned back in his chair. Outside, the wind had been picking up again since afternoon, and the stove was working hard, and the cabin felt smaller than usual, or perhaps just more occupied. How long will it take you to sort through everything? He asked. A week, maybe 2, to have a full picture. She hesitated. There's a lot in here that you haven't been paying attention to. Not badly managed, exactly. More like managed by a man who was focused on keeping everything alive rather than figuring out if it was worth more than just staying alive. He held her gaze. That's accurate. The ranch has more potential than it's operating at. A lot more. She closed the ledger. I think you know that. I've thought it. You just didn't have... She stopped. Someone to deal with the parts I'm bad at, he finished. She didn't look away. We each have different skills. That's actually... She paused, seemed to decide something. That's actually a better position than 2 people who are good at the same things. It was a sensible thing to say, a practical thing, and yet it sat in the room with a bit more weight than strictly sensible and practical things usually carried. Gideon moved first, standing up, finding something to do with his hands. I'll check on the horses. It's not bad weather tonight. I'll check anyway. He went out into the cold and stood for a moment in the dark, looking at the stars that had appeared as the clouds broke, cold and enormous, the way Montana stars got in winter, like the sky was showing off. He was not a man given to examining his own feelings with any great diligence. He'd found, over the years, that feelings were most usefully treated like weather. You acknowledged the conditions, you adjusted accordingly, and you didn't stand in an open field shaking your fist at a storm. But standing there in the dark, he acknowledged briefly and without elaborating on it that the cabin behind him felt different than it had 2 weeks ago. Not better or worse, just different, full of something it hadn't contained before. He went in to check on the horses and spent an extra few minutes there, in the familiar warmth of the barn, sorting through nothing in particular before going back inside. The letter from Margaret Blackwell arrived in March. It came through the county postal system, which meant it had been sitting in Claryville for several days before Gideon's weekly trip into town. It was written on heavy cream paper, in the kind of careful handwriting that announced money and education, and it was very, very polite. It was also, underneath the politeness, a threat. Elena read it twice without expression. Then she set it on the table. She knows about the marriage, she said, apparently. And she's not pleased. She tapped the letter. The section here about the county reassessing the eastern boundary, regardless of changes in the ownership structure of neighboring properties. That's her telling us that she has enough influence at the county level to push through a survey correction whether we object or not. Gideon had read the same lines. Yes. Do you believe her? He considered. She's been operating in this valley for 15 years. She knows the county commissioner. Her former husband, she's a widow, had political connections that didn't dissolve when he died. He paused. I believe she can make serious trouble. Elena was quiet for a moment, looking at the letter. Did she know you before the land dispute started? Personally? In passing. Valley's small enough that everyone knows everyone in passing. And she approached you about the boundary question before she started pushing it officially? Once, yes. What did she offer you then? He looked at her. To buy the eastern 40 acres outright. A fair price. Which you refused. It's good pasture, and I don't like being walked backward. Elena turned the letter over in her hands. She's methodical, she said. She tried the direct purchase. When that didn't work, she filed a survey dispute. When you hired a lawyer, she glanced at him. I didn't hire a lawyer. Elena stared at him. I wrote them a letter myself, he said. I've been meaning to... Gideon. She set the letter down. You've been disputing a land claim from a wealthy, well-connected woman with a professional operation and county relationships, and you've been doing it with a handwritten letter? He was quiet. I need you to tell me everything about this dispute, she said. Everything you know. Every document, every date, everything that's been said and to whom and when. He told her. It took the better part of the afternoon. By the time he was done, Elena was at the table with paper and her pen and a look on her face that he was beginning to recognize. The focused, slightly unsettling look of a person who had found something they were very good at and was quietly rolling up their sleeves. "We need to get to Claryville," she said. "I need to see the county records office. I want to look at the original survey documentation for this entire section of the valley." She looked up. "Can we go tomorrow? Weather's clear." "Good." She tapped her pen against the paper. "She's been patient with this. She filed the dispute 8 months ago, and she hasn't pushed hard since then. She's been letting it sit, letting you worry about it without resolution. That's a strategy. Wearing me down, or waiting for you to make a mistake, or run out of money, or leave." She paused. "None of which are going to happen now." He looked at her across the table. The lamp between them threw soft light against her face and the letter and the neat columns of her notes. "No," he agreed. "They're not." The county records office in Claryville was managed by a quiet woman named Mrs. Purvis, who had the demeanor of someone who had spent 20 years surrounded by paper and had consequently become somewhat papery herself. Thin, deliberate, excellent at filing, and deeply resistant to drama. Elena asked to see the survey records for the relevant section of the valley's eastern corridor. Mrs. Purvis produced them after a short interval of professional rustling. Elena sat at the reading table for 2 hours. Gideon sat beside her, mostly because he had nowhere else to go and nothing else that urgently needed doing. He watched her work through the records with a methodical attention that reminded him peculiarly of the way he moved through terrain he didn't know. Slowly, testing each thing before he put weight on it. After about 90 minutes, she sat back. "There are 2 surveys," she said quietly. "I know. The original from 1861 and the resurvey from 1874, yes." She looked at him. "But there's a third document, a supplementary notation from 1871 before the resurvey that records a corrected measurement from the original because of a transcription error." She pointed to the page. "If you apply the 1871 correction, the eastern boundary sits exactly where you've always placed it, not 40 yards west." She looked at him. "Margaret Blackwell's claim is based on the 1874 resurvey, which wasn't done by the county. It was done by a private surveyor hired by her former husband." Gideon went still. "She might not know about the 1871 document," Elena said carefully. "Or she might know about it and be hoping no one else does." She straightened the papers. "Either way, this is the document that wins your case. But it only wins your case if someone presents it properly. Can you do that?" She looked at him steadily. "I can write the filing, but we need a lawyer to present it to the county board. A real one, not a letter you wrote yourself." He said nothing about that. "I can find one," she said. "There's a man named Farrow in Hartsville who has a reputation for property work. I'll write to him this week." He looked at the document she was pointing to, a piece of paper from 1871 that had been sitting in this room, in this filing system, for over 30 years. "How did you know to look for something like that?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "My father's business partner," she said, "the one I mentioned." She refolded the survey papers carefully. "He used selective documentation to cut my father out of a property they'd bought together. There was a deed and there was a separate agreement, and he used the deed and made sure no one looked at the agreement." She set the papers down. "I learned that documents always have documents behind them, and that the thing someone doesn't want you to find is usually the thing that matters most." Gideon looked at her. She looked back, the same steady, even-keeled regard she always gave things. No performance in it, no request for sympathy, just information, offered plainly. "I'm sorry," he said, "about your father's situation. It was a long time ago. Things got difficult because of it, but we managed." She stood, smoothing her skirt. "Shall we find something to eat? I'm very hungry, and I think better when I'm not hungry." They found a table at the saloon, the only establishment in Claryville that served food during the day, and ate quietly in the corner. At some point during the meal, a group of men at the bar glanced over at them with the mildly speculative attention of people who'd heard interesting things and were measuring the reality against the story. Gideon was aware of it. Elena was aware of it. Neither of them acknowledged it. At some point, one of the men at the bar, Gideon recognized him distantly as someone who worked for Margaret Blackwell's operation, pushed away from the bar and walked past their table on his way to the door. He didn't stop, but he looked at Elena as he passed in a particular way. Not overtly rude, but not respectful either. The kind of look designed to communicate something without having actually said it. Elena picked up her coffee cup and met the man's gaze without blinking until he looked away first and went through the door. Then she set the cup down and went back to her meal. Gideon had watched this with the focused attention of a man trying to decide if he needed to get up from his chair. He decided he didn't. "You've had practice with that," he said. "With what?" "Not looking away." She was quiet for a moment. "My father was not always in a strong position," she said. "People can sense weakness in a situation the way animals sense weather coming, and once they sense it, they test it." She set her fork down briefly. "I learned early that the most important thing is not to give them the information they're looking for." "Which information?" "That you're afraid," she said. "Even if you are." He thought about that. "Were you afraid?" he said. "When you came up my road." She looked at him across the table with an expression that was almost amused. "Gideon," she said, "I was terrified. You were standing on that porch with a rifle and 8 years' worth of reputation and the look of a man who had decided very firmly that he didn't want company. I put the rifle away. Eventually." He looked at his coffee. Something that might have been the precursor to a smile moved through him and was suppressed before it fully materialized, which was the closest he usually got. "Well," he said, "you didn't look it." "That," she said, picking up her fork again, "is the entire point." Chad. Spring came to the valley the way spring always came to Montana. Too slowly. Then all at once. A hard freeze one week, and green stubble pushing through snow the next. The light changed first, stretching longer at both ends of the day, and the animals knew it before the humans did. There was a rhythm developing at the ranch that Gideon couldn't have fully described but was aware of in the way he was aware of how a good fire burned. Not thinking about it, just knowing the heat was there. Elena had finished with the accounts and presented him with a full picture that was better than he'd feared and more complicated than he'd hoped. There were things to fix, decisions to make, investments that would pay out if made now and cost double if left another year. She walked him through them with the same quality of attention she gave everything. Not hurried, not condescending, not performing expertise, just explaining things until he understood them. He made some of the decisions that week and deferred others, and Elena accepted his judgment on the ones he deferred without pushing, which he appreciated more than he said. The mending got done. The salt stores got reorganized. The kitchen began to produce food that involved more than 2 ingredients, which had the effect, unexpected and slightly difficult to account for, of making the evenings feel different. Longer, perhaps. More inhabited. Colt remained, stubbornly and without apology, primarily Elena's dog. The letter to Pharaoh the lawyer had been sent and a response received. He would take the case. The 1871 document, once properly presented, was likely to resolve things in Gideon's favor. But it would take time, and Margaret Blackwell would have the opportunity to respond. There was the sense, in those early spring weeks, of things in motion. Some of them they'd set in motion themselves. Others, as they would discover, were already moving toward them from a direction they hadn't been watching. Margaret Blackwell had been very polite in her letter. She had also been, as Elena had observed, methodical. And a methodical person who had been blocked doesn't usually stop. They redirect. What came next would teach them both something about how far a woman with resources and wounded pride would go, and about what they were capable of, together, when pressed into something they hadn't expected to survive. But that was still ahead of them. For now, there was a ranch coming alive in the spring light, and work enough for 2 people, and a dog that slept under a woman's chair in the evening and got up when her chair moved and settled again where she settled. And Gideon Mercer, who had spent 8 years building a silence he could live in, sat at his table one evening and realized, without drama, without ceremony, that the silence had changed. It had not been taken from him. It had simply been joined. The lawyer Pharaoh wrote back in April with news that was neither good nor bad, but solidly in between, which was how lawyers tended to communicate things when they wanted to make sure you kept paying them. He'd reviewed the 1871 supplementary notation, confirmed its relevance, and filed a formal objection with the county land board on Gideon and Elena's behalf. Margaret Blackwell had 30 days to respond. In the meantime, the eastern boundary was to remain at its current disputed status, meaning neither party could alter the fence line or establish new structures within 40 yards of the contested area. Gideon read the letter twice, passed it to Elena, and went back to fixing the section of north fence that had buckled under the winter's last hard freeze. Elena read it once, folded it, and put it in the document box she'd created for the land dispute. A simple wood and tin box that now sat on the shelf above the table, organized by date, with a running index written on the inside lid. She'd built the system inside of a week, without being asked, and Gideon had regarded it the same way he regarded several of her organizational decisions, with a faint, never quite voiced appreciation that he was fairly sure she noticed anyway. The spring work hit hard and fast, the way it always did. The cattle needed moving to the upper pasture as the lower fields thawed into mud. 2 fences needed complete rebuilding, not just patching. One of the saddle horses had developed a hoof problem over the winter that Gideon had been managing, but that now required more concentrated attention. And there were decisions about the herd, culling, selling, whether to buy 2 additional head to fill out the numbers he'd reduced 2 years ago when he'd been running things alone. Elena rode with him most days. She'd gotten comfortable on the gray mare within a week of arriving, comfortable in the way that showed a person had ridden seriously at some point in their life and hadn't lost it, even if there'd been a gap. She sat a horse without thinking about it, which freed her to pay attention to other things, which was the quality that mattered. She also asked questions. Not the kind of questions that annoyed him, aimless, looking for conversation, but specific ones, about pasture rotation and water sources and what he'd noticed about the eastern slope's drainage pattern. He answered them, and she filed the answers somewhere in that organized interior of hers, and he could see them showing up later in the decisions she offered. Because she did offer them. Not as instructions. She'd learned quickly that he didn't respond well to being told what to do in the broad sense, even when the telling was correct, but as questions with obvious answers. If we moved the herd 2 weeks earlier, would the upper pasture recover faster? Or, I noticed the drainage ditch on the southeast corner is running slower than the northwest one. Is that always the case, or is something blocking it? It was a particular skill, and he recognized it as a skill without being entirely sure how to categorize it. One afternoon in late April, riding the eastern fence line to check on the posts that had heaved over winter, Elena pulled her mare up short and sat looking at the boundary marker, a wooden post with a chipped survey cap that sat at the edge of the disputed territory. "Has anyone moved this?" she asked. Gideon pulled up beside her. He looked at the post. It was sitting at an angle, but fence posts in this kind of soil often sat at angles after a hard freeze. He looked at it more carefully. "The ground around it looks disturbed," Elena said. "Not from frost heave. That would push it a certain way. This looks like it was pulled and reset." He got down from his horse and crouched at the base of the post. She was right. The soil around the base had the look of something that had been opened and closed, slightly different in color from the surrounding ground, and packed rather than settled. He stood up. He didn't say anything for a moment. "If this post has been moved," Elena said carefully, from horseback, "and then a survey is done based on its current position, then the line shifts by however much it was moved." She looked at him. How far would it need to move to establish a 40-yard discrepancy? He looked down the fence line, calculating. "Wouldn't take much. These markers are reference points. If 2 or 3 of them are off, the whole line is off." She was quiet. The horses stood still, the way horses did when their riders were thinking about something difficult. "We should document this," Elena said, "exactly as it is today, before anything else happens." She reached into the saddlebag she'd taken to carrying and pulled out a small notebook. "I'm going to write down the position relative to the surrounding landmarks. You tell me what you see." He told her. She wrote it down. Then she sketched a rough diagram, noting the visible soil disturbance, the angle of the post, the distance from the nearest tree line. It was methodical and quiet, and took about 20 minutes, and at the end of it they both remounted and continued the fence inspection without discussing it extensively, because there was nothing more to be done about it right then, and a great deal else that still needed doing. But riding back toward the cabin that evening, Gideon was aware of something that had been building over the previous weeks. A low-level alertness that he'd had before in his life, in different contexts, when situations were gathering toward a point. The kind of feeling that didn't tell you what was coming, but told you clearly that something was. She's not going to let the legal challenge stop her, he said. It came out more direct than he'd intended, more like a statement of something he'd been turning over privately than a beginning of a conversation. Elena didn't look startled. No, she said. She's going to do something else, something that doesn't go through official channels. Because the official channels might not go her way. Because the official channels have a timeline she can't control. She kept her eyes on the trail ahead. People like Margaret Blackwell are comfortable with pressure. They're not comfortable with uncertainty. You sound like you know her. I know the type, she paused. My father's former partner, the one who used selective documents. She said it without particular heat, as a reference point. He was very organized about his options. He always had something in motion. Gideon thought about that for a while. Then, if she's going to do something, what does she do? Elena was quiet. This was something he'd noticed about her. She didn't fill silence with the first thing that came to mind. She thought, and then she talked, and the talking was almost always worth listening to. She'd go after what you value most, Elena said, which means the land itself or your capacity to operate on it. She paused. Or your reputation, if she thought it would isolate you from the people you rely on. I don't rely on many people. You rely on buyers for your cattle. You rely on Hollis for your supplies. You rely on the valley community to leave you alone. She looked at him. Reputation isn't the same as popularity. You don't need people to like you. You need them to respect you. And they do, partly because you've never given them a reason not to. She paused. If she started a story about you, something that made people uncertain, it would cost you, even if it wasn't true, especially in a place this small. He didn't say anything for a long time. You've thought about this more than I have, he said eventually. I've had more practice thinking about it. They rode the rest of the way in silence, and when the cabin came into view in the early evening light, solid, low, the smoke from the stove making a straight line into the still air, Gideon felt something that was specific and almost concrete, the feeling of a man who has something worth protecting and is just now fully reckoning with what that means. It was not a comfortable feeling, but it was not a bad one either. May brought 3 things: a response from Margaret Blackwell's lawyer, a cattle buyer from Billings named Stokes, who arrived 2 days earlier than expected, and the first real argument Gideon and Elena had. The lawyer's response was long, formal, and essentially said that his client disagreed with every element of Gideon's filing and considered the 1871 document to be of uncertain provenance, meaning they were going to challenge whether the supplementary notation was even legitimate. It was a move designed to slow everything down and run up costs, which Farrow's follow-up letter confirmed with the tone of a man who had seen this tactic before and was annoyed but not surprised. The cattle buyer, Stokes, arrived on a Tuesday and immediately began lowballing the herd numbers with the easy confidence of a man who'd done it successfully many times in the past. He was not unpleasant about it, cheerful, in fact, which was its own kind of aggravating. Elena was standing by the fence when Stokes gave his opening number. Gideon felt himself starting to respond with the usual calculation. How much did he need? How much could he get? Where was the line between acceptable and too low? And then Elena stepped forward without pushing him aside and said, Mr. Stokes, we have the scale records for every animal in that pen. Let's start there. Stokes looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating the situation. The weight records, he said. Correct. She produced the notebook. Average weight on the grade cattle is higher than your number assumed, and the quality cattle are substantially underrepresented in your opening figure. She said it pleasantly, without accusation. I'm sure it's an opening position, so here's ours. She gave him a number. Stokes blinked. Then he laughed. Not mockingly, but with a kind of genuine appreciation. Mrs. Mercer, we also have a second buyer coming at the end of the month, she said, which was true. But we'd prefer not to wait if we can reach a fair number today. They reached a number. It was not everything Elena had asked for, but it was 11% more than Stokes had opened with, and significantly more than Gideon would have accepted on his own before Elena had shown him the scale records 2 months ago. When Stokes left, Gideon looked at Elena. Second buyer, he said. Pete Caldwell's brother-in-law. He mentioned he was looking to buy some grade cattle this season. I wrote to him. She put the notebook back in her coat. He probably won't come. But Stokes didn't know that. Gideon looked at her for a moment longer than he needed to. You never told me you'd written to him. I was going to tell you. You were going to tell me after. She met his eyes. I wasn't sure he'd respond, so I didn't want to mention it until I knew it was useful. Elena. He kept his voice level, but something in it sharpened slightly. If you're making arrangements that affect the operation, I need to know about them. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite defensiveness, but the slight adjustment of a person who has been doing things a certain way for a long time and is encountering friction from it. I've been managing things efficiently. I know you have. That's not what I said. He paused, getting the words right, because getting words right mattered to him in a way that most things did not. This is a partnership. I don't function well when I'm missing information about my own operation. She was quiet for a moment. The horses in the nearby pen moved restlessly. You're right, she said. That's fair. It came out without ego, which was harder than it looked. He'd known people, men and women both, who could not say you're right without making it cost something, without a but that followed and took most of the weight off the admission. She just said it and meant it. Thank you, he said, which was its own small thing. She nodded once, and then, for what it's worth, the 11% gain was real. I know it was. Something released in the air between them, the way pressure released before a storm passed. Next time, she said, I'll tell you what I'm thinking before I write the letter. That's all I'm asking. They went back to work, and the argument was over, and neither of them made more of it than it was. Which was, Gideon thought, another way the two of them fit together that he hadn't expected, and was not going to examine too closely. Or she. June was warm and violent in the way Montana Junes sometimes were. Clear, beautiful mornings that turned into afternoon lightning that rolled across the mountains like something with a grievance. The cattle were settled in the upper pasture, the herd healthy, the hay cutting beginning on the lower fields. It was during the third week of June that Carl Duvain rode up to the ranch. Gideon recognized him from a distance. A broad man, good horseman, riding a bay that belonged to Margaret Blackwell's operation. He came alone, which meant one of two things, courtesy or intimidation, and courtesy was not entirely consistent with the current situation. Gideon was at the fence near the barn when Duvain rode up and stopped. Mercer, Duvain said. Not unfriendly, not the opposite. Neutral. Duvain. Mrs. Blackwell wanted me to deliver something. He pulled a folded document from his coat. Her lawyer's formal challenge to the survey document you filed. County board meeting is scheduled for August. Gideon took the document. Tell her lawyer to file things through the mail like everyone else. Duvain shrugged with the expression of a man who didn't write the policies he was asked to carry out. She also asked me to pass along a word. From her or from you? From her. Duvain settled in his saddle. She said, she's a patient woman, but land disputes are expensive for everyone, and there's a version of this that doesn't need to go to the county board at all. He paused. The 40 acres. She'll pay well above market rate. She said that before. She's saying it again. The answer's the same. Duvain looked at him for a moment. He had the eyes of a man who'd been in enough situations to read them accurately, and what he was reading now was apparently worth nothing much more than a nod, because that was what he gave. All right, he said. He gathered his reins. Duvain. Gideon didn't move. The survey markers on the eastern fence, 3 of them look like they've been disturbed. Duvain's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. The very faint quality of a man who has just touched something he didn't expect to find there. Winter does things to fence posts, he said. Sure it does. They looked at each other. I'd hate for someone to go to the trouble of moving them again, Gideon said, in the same flat informational tone he used for everything. Especially now that my wife has documented their current positions and filed that documentation with Pharaoh's office. A silence. I'll pass that along, Duvain said. I appreciate it. Duvain rode out. Elena had come to the barn door during the last part of the conversation and was standing there with her arms crossed when Gideon turned around. You didn't tell me you'd sent the documentation to Pharaoh. I was going to tell you after, he said. She looked at him. Then the corner of her mouth moved. Fair enough, she said. The thing about escalating pressure was that it moved in stages you could see in retrospect, but were harder to identify in real time. Looking back later, Gideon would be able to map the summer clearly. Duvaine's visit in June, the oddly persistent rumor that showed up in Claryville in July, and then the thing in August that changed the nature of everything. The rumor was small and vague, the way effective rumors always were. Something about Gideon's past, about what exactly had happened the night he'd run 3 outlaws off his property 8 years ago, and whether the version of events that circulated was really the complete story. Nothing specific enough to challenge directly. Nothing with a name attached. But it had a quality to it that Gideon recognized. It was the kind of story that didn't need to be believed to do damage. It only needed to make people uncertain, to introduce a note of, well, you never really know, into conversations that had previously been matter of fact. He heard about it from Caldwell, who remained the decent gossip of the valley. "It's Margaret Blackwell," Elena said that evening, at the table, not asking. "Probably. Definitely." She had her hands flat on the table, looking at nothing, thinking. "It's too targeted to be accidental. She's trying to shift how the county board sees you before the August hearing. It's working some. I could see it at the store today. Hollis was fine, but a couple of men who'd normally nod just didn't." She was quiet. "I'm not going to defend myself against a rumor that doesn't have the decency to have specific accusations in it," he said. "There's nothing to respond to." "No," she said. "You're right. Responding would confirm that it matters." She tapped the table once. "But we need to make sure the county board has all the documentation before August. Farrow needs to be completely prepared, and—" She stopped. "What?" She looked up. "I want to go through everything we have about the night those outlaws came. Not because I want to know—" She paused, changed direction. "Because if someone is going to use that story, we should know exactly what the true version is. So if it becomes necessary, we can be precise." He looked at her for a long moment. This was not a small thing to ask. He hadn't talked about that night to anyone, not in 8 years. Not because it was shameful, but because he'd sealed it up the way you sealed up things that were survivable but not worth reopening. "It was 3 men," he said. "They came for the horses. 2 of them are dead. 1 of them is in a prison in Helena." He kept his voice flat. Not for her benefit, but because it was the only register in which he could say it without it being something else. "I wasn't proud of it. I wasn't ashamed of it either. It was the geometry of who was there and what they came to do." Elena didn't look away. She didn't perform a reaction. She received the information the way she received most things, as something that actually happened, not as something to project onto. "Was there a sheriff's report?" she asked. "Yes. Filed at the time. Sheriff Bray, the one before Tanner, took my statement and investigated. It's on record." "Then we get a copy of it," she said, "before August." "Elena, I know," she said. "I know it's not what you want." She paused. "I don't want to make you drag something out of a box you closed. But if she's going to use it as a weapon, the best way to disarm it is to be the ones holding the true version." She looked at him. "You said it yourself. There's nothing to be ashamed of." He had said that. He looked at the table for a moment, then, "I'll write to the county for a copy of the report. I'll draft the letter. I can write my own letters." "I know you can." She said it without edge. "But I draft them faster, and Farrow has mentioned twice that formal correspondence helps at the county level." He didn't say anything for a moment. "Fine," he said. She got out the pen and the paper. He told her what the letter needed to say, and she wrote it in the flowing formal hand she used for official correspondence. And the next morning it went out with the weekly post. That was the summer. Work and documentation and the slow, deliberate building of a legal case while something else gathered on the edges of things. Something that hadn't shown its full shape yet. By late August, the hearing was 10 days out. Farrow had confirmed he was prepared. The documentation was complete. The 1871 survey notation had been authenticated by an independent historical assessor Farrow had brought in from Missoula, which had cost money they'd had to move around carefully to cover. But it was done. Everything was in order. That was the moment, as Elena had predicted and Gideon had known in that low animal way he trusted, when things stopped being orderly. It was a Tuesday, just past midnight. Gideon woke to Colt barking. Not the alert bark of something noticed, but the hard, continuous bark of something wrong. And the smell reached him at almost exactly the same moment. Smoke. He was out of the bed and at the door before he was fully awake. And when he opened it, the night showed him what he didn't want to see. The barn's eastern wall was lit from inside with a light that was not lamplight, moving and hungry and climbing fast toward the hayloft where 3 months of cut hay sat dry and perfect and ready to burn. He heard Elena behind him, fully awake, and her voice when she spoke was controlled in the way that came from effort, not ease. "The horses," she said. "Go to the well," he said. "Buckets. The horses first. I'll get the horses." He was already moving. "Go to the well." He went into the smoke at a run. The horses got out. That was the first thing, the only thing that mattered in the initial minutes. 4 animals pushed out through the main barn door into the dark, coughing and wild-eyed, scattering into the yard while Gideon held the door open and the smoke poured around him like something alive. The gray mare was the last one out. She didn't want to go. Horses never did when they were frightened, instinct driving them back toward the familiar, even when the familiar was burning. And he had to get his hands on her halter and pull until she came, both of them stumbling out of the doorway and into the cold night air while the hayloft above groaned with heat. He let the mare go. She ran toward the fence line with the others, which was fine. The fence would hold them. Elena was at the water pump with 2 buckets, working the handle with both hands, and he took one from her without stopping and they ran at the east wall together. The fire was in the hayloft mostly, eating through the loose hay with the particular speed that terrified anyone who'd spent time around stored feed. Fast, directionless, throwing embers ahead of itself like a living thing that wanted to expand. They worked the pump and ran buckets for the better part of an hour. Neither of them spoke except in practical terms. More water, watch that beam, get back. And the work was desperate and exhausting, and by the end of it, Gideon's hands were blistered from the pump handle, and Elena had a burn across the back of her left forearm from an ember she hadn't moved away from fast enough. The hayloft was a total loss. The structure itself held, the walls, the main frame, the floor, because the fire had started in the east corner of the loft, and they'd caught it before it reached the support beams. But the hay was gone, and one wall was badly charred, and the smell of it sat over the entire property like something that had come to stay. They stood in the yard at 2 a.m, both of them black with smoke, looking at what was left. Gideon was breathing hard, not from exertion anymore, but from something he was keeping inside his chest by main force. "It wasn't accident," he said. Flat, certain. Elena looked at him. She had smoke in her hair and her face was drawn with exhaustion and the controlled aftermath of fear. "No," she said. "It wasn't. The east corner." "I know." The east corner of the barn was the furthest point from the cabin, which was why neither of them had smelled it until it was already climbing. It was also the most sheltered point from the road, the corner you'd approach from if you wanted to do something in the dark without being seen from either the cabin windows or the main trail. Gideon set his bucket down on the ground. He looked at the barn wall for a moment, then at the yard, then at the access path that ran along the eastern fence, the same general direction as the boundary markers Elena had documented in April. "I need to see it in daylight," he said. "We both do." He looked at her arm. The burn wasn't severe, but it was red and angry looking in the lantern light she'd brought out earlier. "You need to put something on that." She looked down at it like she'd forgotten it was there. "It's fine. Elena, I'll put something on it when we're done looking." He found the lantern and moved along the east wall, holding the light low, not touching anything. Elena walked beside him, equally careful, both of them moving like people who understood that the ground they were walking was evidence now and needed to be treated as such. Near the base of the east corner wall, where the charring was deepest and the burn had clearly started, the ground told a story. The soil near the wall had been disturbed in a rough circle, and within that circle were the remains of something that hadn't been barn hay. A different kind of ash, slightly finer, the color and density of material that had been added rather than native to the structure. And at the edge of the disturbed area, half buried in the dirt, there was the neck and partial shoulder of a broken glass bottle. "Lamp oil," Elena said. Gideon crouched and looked without touching. "Probably. Someone poured it against the base of the wall and lit it, and then left before it caught well enough to see from the cabin." He stood. "Colt woke me up. If he hadn't—" He stopped. He didn't finish the sentence because the end of it was something neither of them needed to say out loud. Elena looked at the broken bottle for a moment.
Then she said very quietly, "She crossed a line." "Yes."
This isn't a legal dispute anymore. No. He picked up the lantern. It stopped being just that a while ago. Tonight is just when she made it impossible to pretend otherwise. They went back inside. Elena wrapped her arm and Gideon washed the smoke off his hands and face, and they sat at the table and didn't sleep, because sleeping was not something either of them were going to manage before dawn. Colt lay under Elena's chair and didn't lift his head the rest of the night. At first light, Gideon rode to Claryville. He went to the sheriff's office first. Tanner was the current sheriff, a methodical man in his early 50s, not especially warm but honest, with the look of someone who had learned to separate what he felt from what he could prove and treated that separation as a professional discipline. Gideon told him what had happened. He showed him the documentation Elena had sent him in a folded envelope, her written account, the description of the bottleneck and the ash pattern, the rough sketch she'd made of the burn area with measurements and compass directions. Tanner read through it. He didn't rush, and he didn't perform surprise. "You're saying it was set," Tanner said. "I'm saying the evidence is consistent with it being set. By Blackwell. I'm saying we have a land dispute with her. She's been escalating, and someone set fire to my barn from the most concealed approach point on my property in the middle of the night." He met Tanner's eyes. "I'm not telling you what to conclude. I'm telling you what happened." Tanner was quiet for a moment. He tapped the edge of Elena's documentation against the desk. "Your wife put this together." "Yes." "She's thorough." "Yes." The sheriff looked at him. "Mercer, I want to come out there today. This afternoon, if I can. I want to see the site before weather gets to it." "I'll be there." He also stopped at Farrow's office. Farrow had an associate in Claryville who took messages and left word that the situation had developed significantly and they needed to speak before the county board hearing. And then on the way out of town, he passed Deacon Hollis's store, and Hollis was on the porch and called out to him, "Heard there was trouble at your place last night?" Gideon stopped. Word travels fast. Hollis had the careful expression of a man who understood he was on the edge of something. "Ned Purvis lives about 2 miles from you. Said he saw the glow in the sky around midnight." He paused. "He also said he saw a rider on the valley road around that time, coming from your direction, moving fast." "Which direction was the rider heading?" "South." Hollis met his eyes. "South Road goes to Blackwell's main gate." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "Hollis, did Purvis say anything else?" "He said the horse had unusual markings, stockings on 3 feet, white blaze." He paused again. "He's seen that horse before. Says it belongs to a man named Reston. Works for Blackwell sometimes, not on the regular payroll, odd jobs." Gideon looked at Hollis steadily. "I appreciate you telling me that." "It's your barn," Hollis said simply. When he got back to the ranch, Elena was at the burned wall with a notebook, doing what she always did when confronted with a problem, building a record of it. She'd measured things, noted the bottleneck's position relative to the wall, cataloged what could be seen in the morning light that hadn't been visible in the dark. He told her about the rider, about Purvis and the horse, and the name Reston. She wrote it down. "Do you know him?" she asked. "By description only. He moves around the valley, takes work where he can find it. Not the kind of man you'd hire if you wanted something on the books." He paused. "Exactly the kind you'd hire if you didn't. We need to find him before he leaves the area. Tanner's coming this afternoon. I'll tell him about Reston." "Tell him about Reston," she agreed, "but also—" She closed the notebook. "We should understand who Reston is before we just hand his name over and wait. If he has prior dealings with Blackwell's operation, if there's a pattern of this kind of work, that's something the county board needs to know, not just the sheriff." Gideon looked at her. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that Tanner is honest, but he's one man and Margaret Blackwell has considerable influence with the county commission." She said it carefully, not impugning Tanner, just being accurate about geography and power. If Reston disappears or recants, we need to have already built the larger picture. Who he is, what he's done, who he's done it for. That's an investigation. "Yes." She met his eyes. "We're good at those, it turns out." He looked at her for a moment. There was smoke still in the air around the burned wall, and the charred smell of it was in everything, and they were both tired in the deep bone way that came from a night of crisis and no sleep, and the sustained effort of holding yourself together through it. And yet Elena was standing there with her notebook, her arm bandaged under her sleeve, looking at him with that steady, forward-pointing focus she brought to everything. And he felt something that was almost unreasonable given the circumstances, a kind of solid, specific trust in the fact of her being exactly where she was. "All right," he said. "Let's build the picture." Sheriff Tanner came that afternoon and spent 2 hours at the site. He took his own notes, collected the broken bottleneck in a cloth, and listened to what Gideon told him about Reston and the writer Ned Purvis had seen. He didn't make promises. That was one of the things Gideon had always respected about Tanner. The man didn't say things he couldn't back up. "Reston's a name I know," Tanner said, looking at the charred wall. "Not a criminal record, but a history of being in proximity to things that later turned into problems." He paused. "Finding him quickly is important. Can you?" "I can try, if he's still in the valley." "Hollis thinks he might be, said Reston had been drinking at the saloon last week and mentioned he'd be around through the end of the month." Tanner turned to look at him. "Hollis knows a lot. He runs a store in a small town. It's basically his job." The sheriff almost smiled, then he put his notebook away. "I want to talk to Ned Purvis, and I want to look at something else." He turned toward the eastern fence line. "You mentioned the boundary markers were disturbed earlier this year. Your wife documented it?" "Filed with Farrow's office. I want to see that documentation." He paused. "Mercer, I'm going to be honest with you. What happened to your barn is serious, but it's only useful in a legal sense if I can connect it to something larger than one hired man deciding to start a fire on his own initiative. The connection to the land dispute is what makes this a pattern and not an isolated event." "Elena has been building that documentation for 5 months, Gideon said. Tanner looked at him with an expression that was the closest he probably got to being impressed. "Then I want to talk to your wife." Look. He talked to Elena for nearly an hour. Gideon was present for most of it, but largely unnecessary. Elena presented the documentation system she'd built, the land dispute timeline, the disturbed boundary markers with measurements and dates, Duvane's visit, and the offer to buy the 40 acres, the legal challenge to the 1871 survey document, the rumor campaign that had run through July, and now the fire and the rider and the name Reston, as a continuous, coherent sequence. It was not performed. She didn't present it as an argument or a case to be won. She laid it out the way she laid out account books. This happened, then this, and here's what the numbers add up to. Tanner sat at the table across from her and read through everything she placed in front of him and didn't interrupt. At the end, he sat back and looked at the document box that sat on the shelf, the one she'd built in March with the running index on the inside lid. And then he looked at Elena. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, "why did you keep all of this?" She seemed mildly surprised by the question, as if the answer was self-evident. "Because I've seen what happens when people don't," she said, "and because I knew from the beginning that this was building toward something. I didn't know what, but I knew enough to be ready for it when it arrived." Tanner was quiet for a moment. "The county board hearing is in 10 days. "Yes, if I find Reston and he confirms what I think he's going to confirm, and if your lawyer presents the full documentation we're looking at." He stopped. Not dramatically, just the pause of a careful man choosing his words. "This becomes a significantly different kind of case." "I know," Elena said. He left in the late afternoon, and the property felt very quiet after he was gone. The horses had been brought back in from the fence line and were in the 3 usable stalls, and the burned wall on the east side of the barn made the whole structure look wounded, which it was. Kicked. Tanner found Reston on a Thursday. He was still in the valley, which was either confidence or stupidity, and Tanner leaned toward stupidity. The man had apparently not expected the fire to become an investigation instead of simply a misfortune. Gideon heard about it through Farrow, who heard it from Tanner, who had made it official in the way careful sheriffs made things official, with written documentation and a formal detainment. Reston had not confessed outright, but he had made the mistake of trying to establish where he had been the night of the fire, and the alibi he constructed had 2 people in it who, when separately questioned, gave accounts that were inconsistent with each other and with his. More significantly, he had cash money on him, new bills, a specific denomination, that matched a withdrawal Farrow's investigative contacts traced, with some difficulty and considerable paperwork, to a financial instrument connected to Margaret Blackwell's household accounts. It was circumstantial. It was not nothing. Reston's hired lawyers, Farrow told Gideon over the post when the letter arrived. But the financial connection is real, and it's going to be very hard to explain innocently. The sheriff is continuing the investigation. The county board hearing remains scheduled. The night Gideon read Farrow's letter aloud to Elena at the table, she sat very still for a moment when he finished. Then she said, "She didn't think we'd be able to trace the money." "No. She thought the fire would push us into giving up, or change the board's perception of us. A man with a burning barn and rumors about his past looks like a liability to a county that values stability." She paused. She was thinking several steps ahead. "But she was thinking about a version of us that didn't exist," he said. Elena looked at him. "She was thinking about a lone man and a woman who had no resources and no standing," he said. "What she got was different." Something passed across Elena's face. Not quite a smile, but related to one. "Yes," she said. "What she got was different." Elena found the additional land records on the second Friday in September, 9 days before the county board hearing, and what she found was not what anyone had been looking for. She had been going through the county records office for the third time. This visit focused not on the survey documentation, but on the broader property transfer history of the valley's eastern section, looking for anything that might shed light on how Margaret Blackwell's operation had expanded over the previous decade. It was painstaking work, the kind that required sitting with dusty ledgers in a cold room and reading things that were mostly not useful until they suddenly were. Mrs. Purvis, the records clerk, had been quietly helpful in a way that suggested she was aware of the Mercer land situation and had formed a private opinion about it that she expressed through which ledgers she happened to set on the table when she restocked the reading area. The document Elena found was a deed transfer from 1879, 7 years prior. It recorded the transfer of a section of land in the Eastern Valley corridor from a man named Collins to Margaret Blackwell's husband, Harold Blackwell, at the time of his death. The deed transfer was standard, but attached to it, filed behind it, not in the main index, visible only if you pulled the full original packet rather than the indexed summary, was a supplementary agreement. The supplementary agreement specified that a 10-acre parcel within the transferred section had been subject to a prior claim by the Collins family and was explicitly excluded from the Blackwell acquisition. It was signed by Harold Blackwell himself, witnessed by 2 men, and dated 3 weeks before his death. The 10 acres it excluded sat inside the 40 acres that Margaret Blackwell was currently claiming belonged on the Mercer side of the boundary correction. Elena read the document twice. Then she sat very still for a moment in the way she did when she was making sure she understood something completely before she moved on it. Then she asked Mrs. Purvis for blank paper and copied the document out by hand, precisely, noting the filing location, the packet number, the date it had been indexed. She wrote everything twice, once in her notebook, once on separate paper to go immediately to Farrow. She rode back to the ranch at a pace that was faster than her usual. Gideon was at the fence on the northwest corner replacing a post. He saw her coming down the trail at a canter and set down his tools. "I found something," she said when she reached him, and her voice was the carefully level voice of a person sitting on top of something they were not going to let themselves celebrate before it was certain. He looked at her. Harold Blackwell excluded 10 acres of the disputed section from his own property acquisition, she said, in writing, witnessed and signed, filed in the county records and apparently never referenced by anyone since his death. She held up the copy. If those 10 acres were never legitimately part of the Blackwell holding, then the boundary claim she's been building her entire dispute on doesn't have the foundation she thinks it does. He was quiet for a long moment. He took the paper from her and read it slowly. "She might not know about this," he said. "She might not." Elena paused. "Or she might know and has been hoping no one else would find it." "Same position as the 1871 survey document." "Yes, except this one is in her own family's filing." She met his eyes. "It is possible, Gideon, that her late husband made an agreement that she never saw, and that she has been prosecuting a land claim in good faith that her husband had already quietly surrendered." He looked at her. "Does that change anything for you?" She thought about it genuinely, which was one of the things about her. So she actually thought about questions like that before answering. "It changes how I feel about her," she said. It doesn't change the fact that she set fire to our barn. No. Whatever her original belief about the land, she crossed into criminal territory when she hired Reston. Elena took the paper back. I have sympathy for a woman who didn't know what her husband agreed to. I have considerably less for one who chose arson. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once, the short, decisive nod he used when he'd made up his mind. Get it to Faro today. I'm going back to Claryville this afternoon. I'll come with you. She looked at him, something registering in her expression. He'd been saying that more lately. I'll come with you. And she'd been noticing it, and he knew she'd been noticing it, and neither of them had addressed it directly because it was the kind of thing that addressed itself slowly, over time, without needing a conversation to ratify it. All right, she said. So the county board hearing took place on a Thursday in late September. The room was the main meeting hall at the Claryville courthouse, a plain space with wooden chairs and poor acoustics that nonetheless filled up beyond what anyone had apparently anticipated, because the valley had been watching this situation develop all year, and the fire in August had focused that attention considerably. Margaret Blackwell was present with 2 lawyers and Carl Devane in an air of composed authority that Gideon recognized from their one prior meeting, the kind of composure that was genuine in its roots, but had developed over many years into something that was also armor. Gideon and Elena sat on their side of the room. Faro was beside them, his document case open on the table. Tanner was present as a witness, not a participant, sitting near the back wall. The board was 3 men. Their chairman was a rancher named Aldous Webb, who had the permanently sunburned look of someone who spent his life outside, and the direct manner of someone who had done too many of these hearings to be impressed by formal presentation. Faro presented first. He was methodical and thorough, and Gideon watched the board's faces while he talked. Webb's particularly, which gave nothing away but whose eyes moved with consistent attention through every document Faro placed before the panel. Then Margaret Blackwell's lawyer presented. He was a skilled man from Billings, well-dressed, with the practiced authority of someone who won cases by making complexity work in his favor. He challenged the 1871 survey notation, challenged the chain of documentation, and characterized the entire Mercer filing as the work of a couple attempting to use paperwork to obstruct a legitimate boundary correction. It was a good performance. Gideon could see it landing on 2 of the 3 board members. Then Faro presented the Harold Blackwell deed exclusion document. The room shifted. It was physical, the way a room shifted when something unexpected entered it, a kind of collective intake, a reorientation. Margaret Blackwell's composure cracked, not dramatically, not the way it cracked in stories where the guilty party dramatically fell apart. It was smaller and realer than that. She turned her head slightly toward her lawyer, and her lawyer leaned close to her, and whatever he said did not appear to settle her. Webb looked at the document for a long time. Then he looked at Blackwell's legal table. Counsel, can you speak to the existence of this supplementary agreement? The Billings lawyer had several seconds of silence that were, in their own way, eloquent. The board should note that the supplementary agreement in question was not known to my client. That wasn't the question, Webb said. Another silence. The document appears to be authentic, the lawyer said finally. Another shift in the room. Webb set the document down. He conferred in a low voice with the other 2 board members for several minutes, while both legal teams sat still, and the audience in the chairs behind them made the sounds of people actively not speaking. When Webb looked up, he addressed the room rather than either specific party. The board is going to take a recess to review the full documentation. This hearing will reconvene in 3 days. He looked at the Blackwell table. Counsel, you will have the opportunity to present any documentation responding to the Mercer filing. That documentation needs to be submitted to this office by tomorrow at noon. He picked up the Harold Blackwell deed exclusion. All of it, not the pieces that are convenient. It was not a ruling, but it was something. Outside the courthouse, in the cold September air, Faro allowed himself a tight, restrained satisfaction that was as close to enthusiasm as men like Faro apparently got. The supplementary agreement changes the geometry significantly, he said. If the board accepts it, and I believe they will, the boundary question becomes considerably more complicated for her side. And the fire? Elena asked. That's Tanner's matter. The board hearing is about the land. The fire is about the law. He paused. Both are going forward. They're separate tracks. Elena nodded. She had her arms crossed against the cold, and she was looking down the main street of Claryville toward nothing in particular. And Gideon could see in the set of her jaw the particular exhaustion of someone who had been running hard for months and was not yet ready to stop. He stood beside her, not saying anything. Colt would be waiting at the ranch. The burned wall of the barn would be there, and the work that remained, and the winter coming. But the document box with the running index on the inside lid had done what Elena had always built it to do. It had held everything they needed, when they needed it, in a form that a room full of people could look at and understand. She turned and found him looking at her. "We're not done," she said. It was not discouragement, more like a statement of the obvious, offered by someone who had never expected to be done quickly and had planned accordingly. "No," he said, "but we're further along than we were." She looked at him for a moment. "Your fence post can wait until tomorrow?" He had left one of the northwest posts half set when she'd ridden up. "Yes." "Then let's go home," she said. Home. She said it the way she'd been saying it for weeks now. Not with performance, not with self-consciousness, just the plain word for the plain place they were going. It still registered in him each time, in the specific way that things registered when they meant more than they had been anticipated to mean. He followed her to the wagon, and they rode out of Claryville together in the cooling afternoon, and the land stretched out around them familiar and large and not entirely settled yet, but theirs. The board reconvened 3 days later and took 40 minutes to reach a decision that Pharaoh described afterward as about as definitive as these things got without being unanimous. 2-1 in favor of the Mercer boundary position, with the dissenting member filing a written objection that Pharaoh read once and set aside without comment, which told Gideon everything he needed to know about its weight. The eastern boundary would remain where Gideon had always placed it. The 1871 survey notation was accepted as legitimate. The Harold Blackwell deed exclusion was entered into the permanent county record. Margaret Blackwell's claim was denied in its entirety. Pharaoh shook their hands outside the courthouse with the restrained satisfaction of a man who had done good work and knew it. Gideon paid his bill in full that afternoon, a number that had grown considerably from the original estimate, but that Elena had planned for, having moved money into a separate account 2 months prior with the quiet foresight that characterized everything she did when she was worried about something she didn't want to say out loud. "You planned for this cost," Gideon said on the ride home, not accusatory, just noting it. "I thought the hearing might run long," she said. "Legal things usually do." "You could have told me you were concerned." She was quiet for a moment. "I didn't want to add to what you were already carrying." He looked at the road ahead. It was a cool October afternoon, the trees along the valley beginning their slow turn, the light at that particular angle that made the Montana landscape look like something out of a painting you'd distrust for being too deliberate. "I can carry more than you think." "I know you can." She paused. "I'm still learning which things to hand you and which things to just handle." He thought about that. "So am I," he said. "For the record." She glanced at him. That almost smile, the one that lived mostly in the corners of her expression rather than the full center of it. "I know," she said. "I've noticed." They rode the rest of the way without speaking, which was its own kind of conversation by now. Reston was formally charged in the first week of October. Tanner had built the case with the same methodical patience that made him a reliable if unglamorous lawman. The financial connection to Blackwell's household accounts, the testimony of Ned Purvis about the rider and the distinctive horse, the inconsistent alibis, and a second witness who emerged after Reston's detainment, a man who'd been at the Valley Road Southern Junction that night and had seen the same horse going south at speed. Reston eventually talked, which was what men in his position usually did when the weight of evidence reached a certain point and the people who'd hired them failed to provide the legal support that had presumably been implied. He didn't give them everything. He was careful enough to protect certain specifics. But he gave them enough, and what he gave them pointed in a direction that Tanner followed with the diligence of a man who had been waiting for something exactly like this to land in his valley. Margaret Blackwell was not charged with arson. There was not enough direct evidence for that. Reston had been careful, and the financial connection was suggestive but not conclusive under the standards Tanner was obligated to meet. What she was charged with was conspiracy to commit property destruction, a lesser charge but not a trivial one. And the process of that charge becoming public knowledge did something that the charge itself perhaps could not have done alone. It destroyed her reputation in the valley, not immediately, not in a single dramatic moment. It happened the way most social collapses happened in small communities, through accumulated conversations, through the weight of everything people had already been noticing and quietly filing away, through the specific loss of trust that followed when a person of wealth and influence was revealed to have operated outside the rules they'd always claimed to support. Margaret Blackwell had spent 15 years building a standing in this valley that rested partly on money and partly on the image of a hard-working widow who'd kept her late husband's operation running through difficult seasons. The charge and the evidence behind it didn't just challenge that image, it inverted it. Carl Duvain left her employ within the month. Gideon heard about it from Caldwell, who said Duvain had taken a position with a rancher up north and had made no comment about his reasons for leaving, which was the kind of restraint that spoke for itself. By November, the word in Claryville was that Margaret Blackwell was making arrangements to sell her operation and leave the territory. Nobody said it with satisfaction exactly, or nobody who said it where Gideon could hear anyway. There was a certain heaviness to it, the way there was always a certain heaviness when something large and long-standing in a community came undone, regardless of whether it deserved to. Elena, when he told her, was quiet for a long time. "She built something real out here," Elena said finally. "The operation, the land, whatever she became at the end of it, it wasn't nothing that she built." "No," Gideon agreed. "It wasn't nothing." "I don't feel good about it," she said. Then she paused and corrected herself. She did that. Corrected herself when she caught herself saying something imprecise. "I feel relieved. About us. About the land. I don't feel good about her." "That seems right to me." She looked at him. "Does it bother you? Any of it?" He thought about it honestly, the way she'd taught him to think about things, not skimming the surface and calling it a conclusion. "The fire bothers me," he said. "It bothers me that she chose that. If she'd kept it in the courts and the county records, I'd have respected her for fighting hard even if I was glad we won." He paused. "The fire it was a decision about what we were worth to her, and the answer she gave was not a good one." Elena was looking at him with the particular quality of attention she sometimes gave him that he still hadn't fully gotten used to. Not analyzing, just present, taking him in. "That's exactly right," she said, quietly. The barn wall got rebuilt in October before the first snow. Gideon did the framing himself, and Pete Caldwell came 2 days running to help with the heavier timbers. Unrequested, just showed up in the morning with his tools, which was the kind of thing Caldwell did that made him genuinely useful to know. Elena kept them both supplied with coffee and food, and periodically appeared with a question about placement or structural approach that was really a suggestion phrased as a question, which Gideon had fully understood for months was one of her methods, and had stopped finding irritating sometime around June. The new wall went up straighter than the original had been. Gideon noted this without commenting on it, because there was nothing useful to say about it. The fire had been destructive and frightening, and had cost them 3 months of hay and a week of sleep and Elena's forearm, which had healed but left a small scar she'd shown him once without drama, just matter-of-factly, when the bandage finally came off. But the wall was straighter now, and the framing was newer, and those were facts. The night they finished, Caldwell stayed for dinner. Elena made a proper meal, roasted meat and winter vegetables and the sourdough bread she'd been developing over the previous 2 months with the focused experimental energy she brought to things she'd decided to master. It wasn't perfect, the bread, and she said so before anyone else could, which was the preemptive move of a person who had a complicated relationship with imperfection. "It's good," Caldwell said. He was not a flattering man, which made the statement reliable. "The crust is too dense," Elena said. "Elena," Gideon said, "it is." "It's also the best bread I've had since my wife made some in March," Caldwell said. He drank his coffee. "And she's a better cook than me, so that's a real comparison." Elena looked at him. Then she made the noise that was her actual laugh, not the polite one, the real one, slightly abrupt, a little surprised at itself. "Thank you, Pete." After Caldwell left, walking to his horse in the dark with the unhurried ease of a man comfortable in the world he occupied, Gideon sat at the table and felt the cabin around him the way he sometimes did now. Not as shelter exactly, or not only as shelter, but as a space that had taken on a different character from the inside out. The document box was still on the shelf. Elena had talked about taking it down, rearranging the shelf for something more practical. He hadn't said anything about that, but he found he was not entirely enthusiastic about the idea of it disappearing. Elena was washing the dishes, her back to him, and he watched her without intending to watch her. It was just where his eyes were. And he thought about February, about a woman coming up his road in the dark, and how the version of this evening that he was currently sitting inside had been entirely unimaginable from that starting point. "You're staring," she said without turning around. "Sorry." "You don't have to be sorry." She did turn then, drying her hands. She looked at him across the small room. "What are you thinking about?" He was quiet for a moment, not stalling, just finding the right entry point into what was actually a complicated interior. "I'm thinking about how different this is," he said, "from what it was." She waited. "And that I don't know what to do with that," he said. "Not in a bad way, just I don't have a lot of experience with things that turn out different than I expected in a direction I didn't plan for." Elena leaned against the kitchen shelf. She had a particular way of holding herself when she was thinking about something carefully. Still, not rigid, like a thing that was resting rather than braced. "Different how?" she said. Not pushing, just asking. "Better," he said. It came out plain and flat, the way he said most things, but there was a weight under it that she'd learned to hear. Considerably better. She looked at him for a long moment. The stove was working steadily, and Colt was under her chair, and the new barn wall was solid outside in the dark, and the document box was on the shelf. "Yes," she said. "It is." Neither of them moved for a moment. Then Elena pushed off the shelf and went back to the dishes, and Gideon stayed at the table, and there was something settled in the air between them that hadn't required more words than that to arrive. November brought the first real snow, and with it the particular stillness of a ranch in winter. The contracted world, the shorter days, the way the cold drove everything indoors, and the hours at the table lengthened. They had a rhythm by now, and it was the kind of rhythm that had grown from utility into something else without announcing its intention. He woke early. She was not far behind. They moved through mornings with an efficiency that came from knowing each other's patterns rather than negotiating them. Who needed the stove first? Where the coffee was kept? What tone of conversation the morning would bear and what it would not. There were things he had learned about her that weren't heroic. She was impatient with vagueness, not rudely, but visibly, in the way her expression went slightly flat when a question that had a specific answer was answered with a generality. She had a low tolerance for cold in the morning that she would not admit to and compensated for by keeping a blanket folded on the back of the kitchen chair and using it with an elaborately casual air. She held grudges quietly, and for longer than she probably thought she did, not destructively, but she did not forget things people had done that were genuinely wrong, and she did not pretend to. He didn't always handle her well. He had days that were closed and flat, days when the old solitude pulled at him and he became monosyllabic and distant in ways that had nothing to do with her and that he was not always good at explaining. She had learned over the months to read the difference between distance that needed space and distance that needed a question, and she did not always get it right, and when she got it wrong and asked when he needed space, there was friction that neither of them enjoyed and both of them recovered from without making it a larger thing than it was. It was not a smooth partnership, but it was a real one. One evening in late November, she was reading at the table. She'd found 2 books at the Claryville General Store and was working through them with the focused pleasure of a person for whom reading was not a casual activity. And Gideon was sharpening tools near the stove, which was the habit he'd never dropped, the stone against the blade in the familiar rhythm. He looked up at some point and she was watching him over the top of her book. "What?" he said. "Nothing." She went back to reading. He went back to sharpening. Then, "You were looking at me." "People look at each other," she said, without looking up. "It's a common human behavior." He considered this. "You've been reading that book for 4 days and you're on the same page you were on yesterday." She lowered the book. Her expression was the one she had when she'd been caught at something and had decided that denying it was beneath her. "I was thinking," she said. "About what?" She set the book down on the table, marking her page with a careful deliberateness that was partly real and partly the small performance of a person composing themselves. "About you," she said, "and about She stopped, started again. About what this is. He set the knife and stone down. He gave her his full attention, which she had learned was not a small thing. Gideon Mercer's full attention had a quality to it, a kind of dense, unhurried focus that made people feel more seen than they'd necessarily bargained for. What this is, he repeated. We started as a practical arrangement, she said. I was aware of that. I accepted it as what it was. She met his eyes directly, which she always did, even when it was harder. And somewhere between the fence markers and the fire, and a very long summer, it became something else. And I'm not asking you to. She paused, and for the first time he saw something genuinely uncertain in her, something that had not fully resolved into the composure she usually wore. I don't need you to answer something you haven't thought about. I just wanted to say it plainly because you know by now that I don't do well leaving important things unsaid. He looked at her. She was waiting. Not anxiously, but with that real quality of suspension she had when she was fully honest about something, and the response wasn't yet in the room. I've thought about it, he said. She waited. I think about it regularly, he said. Since... He stopped, trying to be precise the way she was always precise. Since the summer. Earlier than that, probably, if I'm being honest about it. And I don't know what I'm good at in this territory, he said. It was as close to vulnerable as he got. Not a performance of vulnerability, but the real thing, flat and honest. I've been alone a long time by choice. I was good at that. I'm less experienced at this. I know, she said. I'm not asking for experience. I'm asking what you want. He was quiet for a moment. The stove made its steady sound, and Colt shifted in his sleep near the door, and the wind was working at the cabin in the familiar way it had all winter. I want this, he said. Specifically this, not a version of it where you're less present, or I'm less... He stopped again, moving around words that didn't come naturally. I want the actual thing, not just the arrangement. Elena looked at him for a long moment. Something in her face settled. Not relief exactly, because she wasn't a person who showed relief dramatically, but the particular quieting of someone who had waited for something without being certain it would come. All right, she said. She picked up her book. He looked at her. All right, he said. It's a good answer, Gideon. She found her page. I'm going to keep reading now. He looked at her for another moment. Then he picked up the knife and stone and went back to sharpening, and the cabin held them both in the firelight, and neither of them said anything else about it that evening because they didn't need to. Winter settled in fully by December, and the days contracted down to a narrow band of gray light that the ranch used for its essential work and nothing more. The cattle were managed and the horses kept and the stores counted against the long months ahead. There were problems. One of the grade cattle developed a sickness that Gideon spent 3 cold days nursing before losing the animal anyway, which cost them money they'd already allocated and put a shadow over a week that had otherwise been running well. One of Elena's letters to a seed supplier in Billings was lost in transit and had to be rewritten and resent, and the delay pushed certain spring planting decisions back in a way that frustrated her more than she let on. The cabin's north-facing corner developed a draft that Gideon patched twice before finding the actual gap, which was not where he'd expected it to be. Nothing was smooth. Things broke and healed and broke again in different places. The ranch was a living operation, which meant it had the properties of living things, resilience and also vulnerability, and no period of stability so complete that something wasn't quietly developing at the edge of it. But the ledger at the end of the year, which Elena produced in the last week of December, with the same meticulous organization she brought to everything, showed a number in the positive column that was the best the ranch had seen in the decade Gideon had owned it. The cattle sale in fall had gone well. The operating costs had been trimmed in places Elena had identified in the spring. The legal fees had been significant, but absorbed. The overall picture was better than it had been, substantively better, in ways that required work to achieve and would require more work to hold. He read the ledger through once and set it on the table. You should show me how you built this, he said. Not just the numbers, the system. She looked up from where she was writing. You want to understand the accounting system? If something happens to you, he said, flat and practical the way he said things, I should be able to run it. She was quiet for a moment. That's a very Gideon way of saying you want to learn something. Is there a different way?
She almost smiled. Sit down, she said. I'll show you.
He sat down, and she walked him through it. The categories, the notation system, the way she tracked outgoing against incoming on a rolling basis rather than waiting for the end of the period. He asked 2 questions that were better than she expected, which she told him, and he made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was in that general direction, which was something that had started happening more frequently over the previous few months, and that she had never once commented on, which he appreciated. It was late when they finished, the cabin fully dark outside and the stove burning low. Elena closed the ledger and looked at him across the small distance of the table. In the lamplight she looked tired, but not the exhausted tired of the fire's aftermath. More the tired of a year that had been genuinely hard and genuinely worth it. The particular weariness of people who had been through something together and were still on the right side of it. "We did all right," she said. It was simple. Not triumphant, not falsely modest, just accurate. "We did," he said. She stood, pushed her chair back, and carried the lamp toward the sleeping area. At the canvas she stopped and looked back at him, and the look was the kind that didn't require translation. "Coming?" she said. He reached out and turned down the table lamp and followed her. Spring came back to the valley the way it always did, arguing with winter for 2 weeks before finally winning, the snow pulling back from the south-facing slopes first, the mud arriving before the green, the whole transformation messier and less elegant than the word spring suggested. Gideon noticed it the way he'd always noticed seasonal changes, as information about what needed doing next. The upper pasture needed checking before the cattle went up. The irrigation channel on the east field had partially silted over winter and needed clearing. 3 fence sections wanted new wire. The list was the same list it always was, give or take, adjusted for what the specific winter had done. But the year that followed the winter was different from the years before it, and the difference announced itself in small ways before it announced itself in large ones. Elena had written to 2 neighboring ranchers in February, the Caldwells, and a family named Obert, who ran a modest operation 8 miles north and had been struggling with a disease moving through their cattle herd since December. The letter to the Oberts had included what she'd found in an agricultural publication she'd ordered from Billings, a description of the illness, its likely progression, and the treatment approach that had shown results in similar cases in Wyoming. She'd offered the information without attaching any obligation to it, simply because she had it, and they needed it. Mrs. Obert rode to the ranch in March to thank her in person. She was a tall, tired woman in her 40s who had clearly not expected the gesture and wasn't entirely sure how to receive it, which made the visit slightly awkward in the specific way of people who were more accustomed to managing alone than being helped. Elena made coffee and sat across from her and treated the visit like a normal thing, because, as far as she was concerned, it was one. They talked for an hour about cattle management and spring planting and the state of the road between their properties, which was genuinely bad and had been for 2 seasons. When Mrs. Obert left, she paused at her horse and looked back at Elena on the porch. "I heard things about you," she said, "when you first came. About the situation being unconventional." "It is unconventional," Elena said. "Most useful things are." Mrs. Obert looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded, mounted, and rode north. Gideon had been in the barn during this conversation and came out to find Elena still on the porch, looking at the road where Mrs. Obert had gone. "How was that?" he asked. "Fine," Elena said. "She's a good woman who's had a hard couple of years." She paused. "We should look at the road between here and their property. If we could work with the Oberts and the Caldwells on a joint repair, we'd all benefit from it." He looked at her. "You're already planning the next thing." "I'm thinking about it," she said. "There's a difference." There wasn't much of a difference, but he didn't say so. So, the Reston case concluded in April. He was convicted of property destruction and sentenced to 18 months. It was not a long sentence, and Gideon had understood from Tanner early on that it wasn't going to be. The evidence, while solid, had been circumstantial on the central question of who had hired him, and the charge had been reduced from the initial filing. The conspiracy charge against Margaret Blackwell had been dropped in February after her lawyers produced documentation and testimony that placed enough reasonable uncertainty around the financial connection to make the county prosecutor unwilling to take it to trial. Tanner told Gideon this in person, which was a courtesy the sheriff didn't have to extend, and that Gideon appreciated accordingly. "I know it's not everything," Tanner said. "It's more than nothing," Gideon said. "The land question was resolved. Reston's convicted. She's leaving the territory." Tanner looked at him steadily. "In practical terms, you won." "In practical terms," Gideon agreed. He told Elena that evening. She received the news about the drop charge with a stillness that he recognized as controlled frustration. Not at him, not at Tanner, at the shape of things. "She ordered that fire," Elena said. "We both know that." "Yes." "And she walks away because her lawyers were better than the evidence." "Yes." She was quiet for a long moment, looking at the table. "That's how it works sometimes." "That's how it works sometimes," he agreed. He didn't dress it up. She wouldn't have wanted him to. She looked up. "Reston was the one who lit it," she said. "He's the one serving time, and the land is ours legally and permanently." She paused. "It's not a perfect outcome." "No. But I can live with it." He looked at her. "Can you actually, or are you telling yourself you can?" She held his gaze. That was one of the things he'd started doing over the winter, pushing slightly past her composed surface when he thought there was something else underneath, not intrusively, just the way you tested ice before putting your weight on it. She'd noticed he was doing it and had not, to his surprise, objected. "A little of both," she said honestly, "but mostly, actually." She picked up her coffee cup. "Justice is not always complete. My father taught me that. Sometimes the best you can say is that the important things were protected." "The important things were protected," he said. She nodded once and drank her coffee, and the evening moved on. Margaret Blackwell sold her operation in May to a cattle consortium from Helena. The sale was handled through lawyers and intermediaries and concluded without ceremony. By June, her house was empty and the new owners were installing their own foreman, a practical-looking man from Wyoming who rode the property boundaries his first week and made no mention of any eastern boundary disputes, because as far as the public record was concerned, there weren't any. The valley noticed her departure the way small places noticed the departure of something long established. Not with celebration, not with mourning, but with the particular adjustment of a community rearranging itself around an absence. People who had orbited her influence reoriented. Certain alliances that had been organized around proximity to her money became unnecessary. The county commissioner, a man named Fletcher, who had always been careful to maintain a publicly neutral position on the Mercer land dispute, began making himself considerably more friendly in the general direction of the Mercer ranch. Gideon observed this with the flat, unsentimental accuracy that was one of his more reliable qualities. He was waiting to see which way it landed, he told Elena. "Of course he was," she said. "That's what people in his position do." She didn't say it with contempt, more with the matter-of-fact acceptance of someone who understood how power calculated its allegiances and didn't expect it to behave otherwise. "It bothers you less than it probably should," he said. She thought about it. "My father was bothered by things like that," she said. "It cost him a lot of energy that didn't produce results." She paused. "Fletcher's useful to us now. I'd rather use him than resent him." Gideon looked at her. "You're more practical than most people realize." "Most people see the composure and think it's the whole thing," she said. "It's not." He knew that. He'd known it since March of the previous year when she'd produced a 5-month documentation system that had been built on the belief that they were going to need it. The composure was real, but it was built on top of a kind of clear-eyed pragmatism that didn't flinch from the way things actually worked. It was one of the things he loved about her. He used the word in his own mind without alarm now, which had taken longer than he would have admitted. The road project happened in June. It had been Elena's idea in March, emerging fully formed from her conversation with Mrs. Obert, and over the following 3 months, she had turned it from an idea into a plan, and then into a thing that actually happened, which was the trajectory most of her ideas followed once she'd decided they were worth pursuing. The 3 ranches, Mercer, Caldwell, and Obert, contributed labor and materials over 2 weeks, working the 6-mile stretch of road that connected their properties to the main valley route. It was not glamorous work. It was digging and grading and laying gravel and fixing the drainage ditch that had been causing the worst of the spring rutting, and it was hot in June and the work was slow, and the progress was not always visible until suddenly it was. On the 3rd day, Pete Caldwell's younger brother showed up unasked with a mule team. On the 5th day, a rancher named Sutter from the southern end of the valley came to watch, and then picked up a shovel and stayed for the afternoon. By the end of the 2nd week, the road was substantially better, and there were 7 people involved who had not all been on speaking terms at the start of it. Elena didn't take credit for any of this, which was partly modesty and partly strategy, because she understood that projects people felt ownership over were more durable than projects attached to a single person's name. She asked questions and made suggestions, and showed up every day with enough food to feed more people than she'd expected to feed, which was the kind of practical foresight that people noticed without always identifying as leadership. Gideon worked alongside the other men and said very little, which was normal, but he watched the whole thing with a sustained attention that went beyond his usual observation of practical tasks. On the last day, riding back to the ranch with the early summer light going long and gold across the fields, he said, "You built something there." Elena looked at him. "We built a road." "You know that's not what I mean." She was quiet for a moment. The horses walked at their usual unhurried pace, and Colt ran somewhere in the grass off to the side, doing whatever he did when off-leash that he apparently considered very important. "I grew up watching my father try to do things alone when he didn't have to," she said. "He was proud in a way that cost him. Not badly. He wasn't a fool. But he never quite believed that asking for help was a different thing from admitting weakness." She paused. "I think I inherited some of that. I've had to learn the difference." He looked at her profile, the way she held the reins, the slight set of her jaw when she was working through something she'd thought about many times but hadn't said recently. "You learned it better than you think," he said. She glanced at him. Something in her face was softer than her composure usually allowed. "So did you," she said, coming in from the other direction. That was accurate. He'd spent 8 years making a virtue of needing no one, and the truth of it was that the virtue had been partly real and partly the story a man tells himself when the alternative is too complicated to figure out. What he'd learned over the past year and more was that needing someone specifically, not just anyone, but a specific person whose specific qualities made specific things possible, was not the same as weakness. It was closer to the opposite. He didn't say all of this. Most of it he'd never say, because it wasn't the way he operated, and Elena knew that, and didn't ask him to be different than he was. But some of it was in the look he gave her, and she received it in the way she received things from him that came in that form. "Come on," she said. "The horses want dinner." Well, the summer was the best the ranch had seen, not because nothing went wrong. Things went wrong in the specific ways that ranch operations always produced problems, with a kind of creative variety that suggested the frontier had a commitment to not repeating itself. A water pump failed in July and took a week to repair. 2 of the cattle had to be sold earlier than planned when their condition dropped below what Gideon wanted to winter over. A late August hailstorm took a section of the new barn wall and required 2 days of repair that Elena had not budgeted for, which put a look on her face that he now knew to mean she was mentally restructuring the fall accounts. But the cattle sale in September hit the numbers Elena had projected in June, largely because she'd arranged for the second buyer, the Caldwell brother-in-law who hadn't materialized the year before, to actually be present this time, a fact she'd managed with a quiet thoroughness that only revealed itself when Stokes, the buyer from Billings, arrived and found he had company. The number they reached was the best Gideon had gotten in 10 years of selling cattle. "You planned this in June," he said afterward, when Stokes had loaded his animals and driven south. "I thought about it in June," she said, the same distinction she always made. "Elena." She looked at him with the expression that was the closest she got to purely amused. "Yes," she said. "I planned it in June." He shook his head slowly, not with frustration, with something that was the affectionate equivalent of exasperation, the response of a person who had learned to be consistently surprised by the same quality in someone and had stopped expecting to stop being surprised by it. "We need to hire someone, chick," he said. It was a conversation that had been circling for months. "The operation is big enough now. I can't do the full work alone, and you can't manage the accounts and also work the fence line." "I know," she said. "I've been thinking about that." "I'm sure you have. There's a young man in Claryville. Hollis mentioned him. His family's from Nebraska. They came up last year. He's been doing day labor, looking for a steadier position." She paused. "I thought we might talk to him." "How old?" 19. Gideon considered. "Young." You were doing this kind of work at 19. I was doing it badly at 19. Then you have experience relevant to training him, she said, and walked back toward the cabin before he could formulate a response to that. The young man's name was Thomas Hale, and they hired him in October, which meant he arrived just in time to help with the work of closing the ranch down for winter. The least glamorous introduction to a new position, involving a lot of cold mornings and repetitive tasks, and the general unglamour of seasonal preparation. He was quiet, willing, and made several mistakes in the first 2 weeks that Gideon corrected without drama, and Elena corrected with the specific precision of someone who wanted the correct behavior to replace the incorrect one, rather than just the awareness that a mistake had occurred. By November, he was competent at his assigned tasks. By December, he was asking better questions than his assigned tasks required, which was the quality Gideon valued most in anyone who worked with their hands. Not the absence of mistakes, but the evidence of a mind paying attention to why things were done the way they were done. "He's going to be good," Elena said, one evening after Thomas had gone to his bunk in the small addition they'd built onto the barn's north side for hired help. "Probably," Gideon said. "He needs to learn to check the pump housing before he checks anything else in cold weather. He's done it backwards twice." "I'll tell him tomorrow. I'll tell him tomorrow," he said. She looked at him. He looked back. It was the kind of small negotiation they had regularly about who handled which parts of what, and it never quite settled permanently because the right answer changed depending on context, and they'd both accepted that. "All right," she said. December came in cold and clear, the sky at night enormous and indifferent, the way Montana sky got when the clouds cleared and the stars had no competition. Gideon was checking the horses one evening, still a habit, always would be, when he stopped at the barn door and stood for a moment looking at the cabin. The light was on in the window, the specific warm color of lamp and firelight that meant Elena was at the table, probably reading or writing letters or doing the kind of thinking that looked like reading from the outside. He stood there longer than he needed to. There was something he'd been carrying for a few weeks that he hadn't found the right way to say, partly because he wasn't certain of his own words on the subject, and partly because it was the kind of thing that once said couldn't be unsaid, which was true of most important things and didn't make them easier. He went inside. Elena looked up from the table. She read his face the way she'd learned to read his face, not interpreting, just registering, giving him the room to arrive at whatever he was going to say. He sat down across from her and was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking," he said. She waited. "About next year," he said. "About what this is going to look like." He paused. "And whether this is what you plan for yourself, before everything." She looked at him carefully. "What do you mean?" "You came here because you had no other option," he said. "I know that. I've always known that. And you've built something real here, and I believe you want to be here now, not just that you have to be." He stopped. "But I want to know that the life you're building is actually the life you want, not a version of it you accepted because it was what was available." The room was very quiet. The stove made it sound, and outside the wind was light, and Colt lifted his head and then put it back down. Elena looked at him for a long moment. There was something in her expression that he rarely saw. Not vulnerability exactly, because she was not a vulnerable woman in the way people usually meant that word, but something underneath the composure that was real and undefended. "When I came up your road," she said slowly, "I was carrying a letter and about 2 weeks' worth of hope, and I was genuinely afraid that you were going to send me back into the dark." She paused. "I wasn't planning for a life. I was planning for a next step, and then another one after that, and I was trying not to think too far ahead because thinking too far ahead was how people fell apart." He waited. "And then you said, 'Come inside,'" she said, "and I came inside, and the rest of it happened." She met his eyes fully. "I didn't plan for this, Gideon, but I want it. Not because it was available, because it's actually what I want." She paused, and something quieter came into her voice. "Because you are who I want, specifically." He looked at her across the table. The word specifically, she'd used it the way he sometimes used it, because she'd learned that specificity was the closest he got to poetry, and she'd adopted it accordingly, which was itself a specific thing that undid him slightly. "All right," he said. "All right," she agreed. He reached across this table and put his hand over hers. She turned her hand over and held his, and they stayed like that for a while without either of them needing to add anything to it. Oh, the Valley remembered the Mercer Ranch differently by the following spring, not because anything dramatic had announced the change, but because the accumulation of a year and a half of visible work, the road, the Obert cattle advice, the fair dealing at the cattle sales, the general evidence of an operation running well and not running over anyone in the process, had quietly settled into the community's understanding of who these people were. Gideon Mercer was still not a man people approached casually or pushed without expecting to be pushed back. That quality had not softened, and he hadn't tried to soften it because it was part of what he actually was, and he'd long since stopped apologizing for the parts of himself that were inconvenient but genuine. But the stories about him changed in register, from something cautionary to something more like foundational. The man who'd fought off outlaws and held his land and built something real out of years of solitude, not a legend, which was too large and too fictional, but a fact of the landscape. Elena became, more gradually and more deliberately, the person people came to with problems that required more than one kind of thinking. Not officially. There was no title, no formal arrangement, but the letter she'd written to the Oberts in February was remembered, and the road project was remembered, and word spread in the way word spread in small communities, incrementally, person to person, specific incident attached to specific name, until the name started to mean something beyond the person. She was not comfortable with all of it. She told Gideon once, in the direct way she always told him things she was ambivalent about, "I don't want to be the person everyone brings their problems to. I have enough problems." "You keep solving them, though," he said. "I know," she said, with the slight frustration of a person who understood their own patterns and was not always at peace with them. "I can't seem to stop." "You could try." She looked at him. "Could you stop checking the pump housing 3 times in cold weather?" "No." "Then don't give me advice about stopping things that are just what I do." He looked at the ceiling briefly, then back at her. "Fair." But Thomas Hale lasted through the winter and into a second year, which told Gideon everything he needed to know about the young man's suitability. By spring, he was trusted with sections of the work that Gideon had not delegated to anyone in years. The cattle management on the upper pasture, the weekly check of the eastern fence, the repair decisions on the equipment that wore out in the normal course of operations. He made mistakes still. The pump housing cost him a correction from Gideon in January that he did not repeat. He underestimated the weight on the spring cattle sale, and Elena corrected his figures with the same direct precision she'd used on Gideon's estimates 2 years prior. He learned, which was the only thing that mattered. One afternoon in April, Gideon found him sitting on the fence of the north pasture watching the cattle with the specific quality of attention that meant he was thinking rather than resting. "Question," Thomas said, when Gideon came up beside him. "All right. The operation here, the way it runs." He paused, looking for words in the careful way of a young person who'd learned to think before speaking, which was a quality someone had presumably taught him, or he'd taught himself through consequences. "Did you plan it to work this way? 2 people with different skills, the accounting and the land work, the way you and Mrs. Mercer divide things up?" Gideon looked at the cattle. "No," he said. "It came out of necessity." "But it works." "Yes." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "My parents' operation back in Nebraska failed," he said. "Not from bad work, from my father not knowing what he didn't know, and not having anyone who could fill that." He paused. "He was a better farmer than most people I've seen, but he couldn't account for what he was growing, and he wouldn't ask for help with it." He looked at Gideon. "I think about that." Gideon stayed quiet. He wasn't a man who filled silences with comfort when the other person was working something out. "I don't want to do that," Thomas said. "Not know what I don't know." "Then you're already ahead of most people," Gideon said. He got down off the fence and went back to work, and didn't elaborate because that was enough. But he thought about it later, at the table in the evening, while Elena was writing in the ledger and the lamp was burning, and Colt was in his permanent position under her chair. He thought about a boy in Nebraska watching a capable man fail, because capability in one direction is not the same as capability in all directions, and how long it had taken him to learn that himself, and at what cost, and from what unlikely direction the learning had finally come. "You're thinking again," Elena said, without looking up. Always. What about? He looked at her across the table, the lamp between them, the ledger under her hand, the document box still on the shelf, no longer urgent but not removed either. She'd said once that she kept it because she believed in knowing where the records were, which was true, but he suspected there was something else in it too, something about not forgetting what they'd had to do to get here. About how things that work out, he said, usually don't work out the way you planned them. She looked up. That's true? It's a strange thing to be glad about, he said. That none of it went the way I would have planned it, because if it had, it would have been worse. She held his gaze, and something passed across her face that was not complicated, just warm and clear, and the particular quality that his presence brought out in her that she'd stopped trying to keep from showing. Yes, she said, considerably worse. Outside, the Frontier Spring was doing what Frontier Springs did, working its way in from the edges, imperfect and argumentative and not particularly concerned with anyone's plans. The ranch sat in it the way it always had, 400 acres of land that had been worth fighting for and had been fought for, held by two people who had arrived at each other by accident and stayed by choice. It was not a grand ending, the kind that announced itself. It was the ending of people who had too much work to do to stop and recognize an ending, which was the only kind that lasted. The lamp burned. The stove held its heat. Elena went back to the ledger and Gideon went back to his own thoughts, and the cabin held them both, and the land outside held the cabin. And that was enough, and had always been enough, and they both knew it.